Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The room with no exit. It started with a job interview. I had been unemployed for months, and when the email arrived inviting me for a second round at a small consulting firm, I barely glanced at the address before responding with an eager yes. The day came, and I found myself standing outside an unassuming office building. It was old, tucked away on a quiet street I hadn't noticed before, its brick facade grimy from years of neglect. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a tired smile and directed me to room 32 on the 6th floor. I rode the elevator up, the stale smell of metal and cleaning fluid thick in the air. It was one of those older elevators with a clunky manual door, the kind you don't see much anymore. It groaned under my weight, as if protesting the climb. The 6th floor was eerily quiet. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, their cold glow reflecting off scuffed linoleum. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with identical gray doors, each marked with a simple black number. I found room 32 at the very end of the corridor. I knocked. No answer. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Hesitant, I turned the knob. The door opened with a faint creak, revealing a small, windowless office. A single desk stood in the center of the room, with 2 chairs on either side. Papers were scattered across the desk, as if someone had left in a hurry. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside. My voice sounded muffled, absorbed by the thick walls. I checked my phone, no signal. Typical in older buildings like this, I thought. I decided to wait, assuming the interviewer had stepped out for a moment. The door clicked shut behind me, and an uneasy chill ran down my spine. I turned, instinctively reaching for the handle, but it didn't budge. It wasn't locked, it was as though the door had fused to the frame. Panic flickered in my chest. I yanked harder, twisting the knob until my knuckles ached, but it wouldn't move. "Hey!" I shouted, pounding on the door. "Is anyone out there?" Silence. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just a door. Maybe it was stuck. I glanced around the room for something I could use to pry it open, but aside from the desk and chairs, the room was bare. The overhead light buzzed softly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as I moved. I sat down in one of the chairs, trying to collect my thoughts. Minutes passed. Then what felt like hours. My watch read 3:30, but I couldn't be sure anymore. Time felt distorted, sluggish, like I was moving through molasses. The papers on the desk caught my attention. I reached for them, flipping through what seemed to be old employee files. Names, numbers, dates, all neatly typed but faded with age. A name at the bottom of one page jumped out at me, my own. I froze. My name, my birth date, my address. It was all there, printed in black ink. The file looked aged, the paper brittle, but the details were current. How was that possible? I hadn't given this company my address, not in this level of detail. A faint tapping sound interrupted my spiraling thoughts. It was coming from the wall behind me. I turned sharply, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound continued, steady, rhythmic, like someone tapping their knuckles on the other side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. I stood and moved closer to the wall, pressing my ear against it. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakably human, low and urgent, as if warning me. I stepped back, fear coiling in my stomach. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows in the room growing darker, more defined. I could feel the air thickening, pressing down on me. The light above flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When it came back on, I wasn't alone. A figure stood on the opposite side of the desk, its face obscured by a hood, its presence heavy and suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at me. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, its hands still outstretched. The shadows around it seemed to ripple, reaching out toward me like tendrils. I backed away, my legs shaking. The light flickered again, and the figure was gone. But the air in the room felt wrong, charged with something I couldn't explain. I tried the door again, yanking with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping started again, louder this time. The whispers grew, overlapping, chaotic, as if a crowd of voices was speaking all at once. I pressed my hands over my ears, sinking to the floor. The shadows crept closer, swallowing the light, until all I could see was darkness. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light flickered back on, and the door creaked open on its own. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. The hallway was empty, the air silent. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building and back on the street. I never went back. The company never contacted me again, and when I tried to look them up online, there was no trace of them. No listing, no reviews, no records. Room 32 doesn't exist. At least, not anymore. The Vanishing Station. I was on my way home late, much later than I planned. The meeting had dragged on forever, and by the time I reached the train station, the streets were nearly deserted. I could feel the cold settling into my bones as I descended the cracked concrete stairs leading to the platform. The station was one of the older ones, long past its prime. Its yellow tiles and dim fluorescent lights gave it a lifeless, sepia-toned look. I was relieved to see a train already waiting on the far track, its doors open, humming quietly. But the clock on the wall caught my eye. There was something odd about it. The hands pointed to 9 o'clock, but I knew it was nearly midnight. I shook off the thought, chalking it up to a broken clock. I just needed to get home. The platform was empty, save for an older man sitting on a bench near the edge. He wore a long coat and a bowler hat, a newspaper spread out across his lap. He didn't look up as I walked past. I checked the timetable on my phone. The next train to my stop wasn't due for another 15 minutes, so I leaned against a pillar and waited. My eyes wandered back to the man on the bench. Something about him felt off. Maybe it was how still he was, or the way his head tilted slightly forward, as if he were reading, though he hadn't turned a page in minutes. The sound of the train doors hissing open caught my attention. I turned toward it, expecting to see someone step out, but the car remained empty. The lights inside flickered faintly, casting unsettling shadows across the seats. I decided to keep my distance. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were coming from behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing off the tile walls. I turned around, but the platform was empty. The man on the bench hadn't moved, his head still bowed over his newspaper. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing back to me. No response. I clenched my hands into fists, my palms damp with sweat. The footsteps stopped. I walked toward the edge of the platform, glancing down the tunnel. It was pitch black. The kind of darkness that swallowed everything whole. A breeze rushed past me, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and rusted metal. The train on the far track hissed again, and the doors closed with a mechanical finality. When I looked back at the bench, the man was gone. The newspaper lay crumpled on the seat, but he was nowhere in sight. I spun around, searching for him, but there was no sign he'd ever been there. The platform was silent, the air unnervingly still. My heart raced as I turned back to the timetable screen, hoping to distract myself. But the screen was blank now, its digital glow replaced by an ominous static. My phone, too, had lost its signal, the display reading in no service in blocky letters. The hum of the train grew louder, almost like a low growl, and the fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker. I looked toward the tunnel, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the darkness, too far to make out clearly but close enough to know it was watching me. It didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there, a shadowy outline against the black void. I felt my legs lock in place, fear rooting me to the spot. I wanted to run, to bolt up the stairs and out of the station, but my body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate. Each step echoed unnaturally, louder than it should have been, like the sound was being amplified by something unseen. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My back hit the pillar, and I nearly collapsed. The train's hum rose to a deafening pitch, and suddenly the lights went out completely. The station was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its faint glow my only source of light. I aimed it toward the tracks, toward where the figure had been, but it was gone. The sound of breathing filled the silence, deep, rasping breaths that weren't my own. They were close, impossibly close, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. I swung my phone's light wildly, but it illuminated nothing but empty space. The breathing stopped, and for a brief moment, so did my own. Then, from the pitch-black tunnel, I heard the screech of metal on metal, a horrible grinding sound that made my teeth ache. A second later, a train barreled out of the darkness, its headlights blinding, its horn shrieking like a warning. It wasn't stopping. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the edge of the platform as the train rushed past. But as it passed, I realized something. There were no passengers. No conductor. Just rows of empty seats and windows that reflected nothing, not even the light from my phone. The train disappeared into the opposite tunnel, and the station fell silent again. The lights flickered back on, the timetable screen blinked to life, and my phone buzzed with a sudden surge of notifications. Everything looked normal, as if nothing had happened. But when I glanced at the bench, the newspaper was gone. And so was the platform clock. I didn't wait for the next train. I ran up the stairs, into the cold night air, and kept running until I reached my apartment. I haven't taken the train since. The locked room in the library. I was working late at the university library, buried under a stack of research papers. The place was mostly empty, save for a few students scattered across the vast, dimly lit reading hall. It was quiet, the kind of silence that amplified every creak and shuffle. Outside, rain tapped insistently against the tall, arched windows. I had a paper due in 3 days, and despite my exhaustion, I was determined to finish. My laptop battery was dwindling, so I packed up and moved toward the back of the library, where I knew there were wall outlets. The rear section was older, less modernized, with towering wooden shelves and a faint, musty smell of aged paper. As I settled into a creaky chair, I noticed a door at the far end of the corridor. I had never seen it open, nor had I thought much about it. It was plain, with peeling gray paint and a brass handle that had dulled with time. Above it, a small, barely legible sign read, "Archives Staff Only." Curiosity tugged at me. In all my years at the university, no one had ever mentioned the archives. What could be so important to keep locked away? I dismissed the thought and plugged in my laptop, refocusing on my notes. But the door wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I glanced up, it seemed closer, though I knew it hadn't moved. A strange feeling began to settle over me, a faint hum of unease. The soft glow of the overhead lamps flickered momentarily, and I felt an irrational pull toward the door. I told myself it was just fatigue. Still, I couldn't help but get up and walk toward it, as if drawn by some invisible thread. The hallway grew colder with every step, the warmth of the reading room receding behind me. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The brass handle was icy to the touch. I pressed my ear against the wood, half expecting to hear nothing, but there was a faint sound, like whispers, too low to understand, layered over one another. I should have walked away. Instead, I tried the handle. To my surprise, it turned easily, and the door swung open with a soft groan. Inside was a narrow staircase, descending steeply into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood. The whispers grew louder. I don't know what compelled me to step inside, but I did. My feet moved as if on their own, taking me down the stairs one at a time. The dim light from the hallway above grew weaker with each step, until I was enveloped in near total darkness. My phone's flashlight became my only guide, illuminating rough stone walls and a floor littered with old, crumbling books. At the bottom of the staircase, the space opened into a large, circular room. Shelves lined the walls, packed with more books, their spines warped and faded. In the center of the room was a single table, and on it sat an open book, its pages yellowed and brittle. I approached the table cautiously. The book's text was handwritten in a language I didn't recognize, curving, looping symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I stared at them. My pulse quickened. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, though the room was empty. I reached out to touch the book, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, the sound of a door slamming echoed from above, and the staircase behind me disappeared into solid stone. My phone flickered, its light dimming until it went out completely. Panic set in. I stumbled back, my hands searching for the stairs, the walls, anything, but all I felt was cold, rough stone. The room seemed to grow smaller, the shadows pressing in around me. The whispers returned, louder than before, their tones sharper, almost angry. And then, I felt it, a presence. It was behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. My body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't turn, couldn't even scream. The air grew colder, so cold that it burned, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. My vision blurred, my head spinning. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the book on the table, its pages now blank. When I woke, I was back in the library's reading room, slumped over my laptop. The clock on the wall showed it was past 3 in the morning. The library was silent, and the lights overhead buzzed softly. My body ached, my clothes damp with sweat. I glanced toward the back corridor, but the door to the archives was gone. In its place was a solid wall of bookshelves, as if it had never existed. I packed my things and left without looking back. The next day, I tried to ask the librarian about the archives, but she just looked at me, puzzled. "There's no archives here," she said. The quiet ones in the cinema. It was a rainy Sunday, the kind of day that made you want to curl up and forget the world existed. But I needed a break from my apartment and its creeping silence, so I decided on a movie. Something light, I thought, something to lift my mood. The theater was nearly empty when I arrived, its neon marquee flickering weakly against the gray sky. Inside, the lobby smelled of stale popcorn and disinfectant. A bored-looking teenager at the counter handed me my ticket without so much as a glance. "Screen 6, he mumbled, pointing down a dimly lit hallway. The theater itself was larger than I expected, with rows of red velvet seats stretching into the shadows. I chose a spot in the middle, perfectly centered for the best view. The previews hadn't started yet, and the screen was a blank, faintly glowing canvas. I was alone at first, enjoying the stillness, but just before the lights dimmed, I noticed a few others trickling in. There were no more than 6 or 7 people, all scattered throughout the room. They moved quietly, their faces obscured by the dim light. The movie began, a cheerful comedy, exactly what I needed. I let myself relax, sinking into the familiar rhythm of jokes and laughter. But as the first act progressed, I realized something odd. No one else in the theater was laughing. Not even a chuckle. I glanced around. The people sat motionless, their faces turned toward the screen but eerily still. It wasn't just their lack of laughter, they weren't reacting at all. No shifting in their seats, no rustling of popcorn bags, not even the faint glow of a phone screen. I felt a prickle of unease, but told myself I was imagining things. Maybe they were just engrossed in the film. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned back to the screen, I felt a faint pressure, as though eyes were boring into the back of my skull. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the movie, but my skin crawled with the weight of their silent stares. Halfway through, I couldn't take it anymore. I glanced back over my shoulder. The people were no longer sitting. They were standing now, their outlines barely visible in the faint light of the screen. All of them, perfectly still, facing me. I couldn't make out their faces, but I knew, somehow, they weren't looking at the movie. They were looking at me. I turned back sharply, my heart pounding. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired. I tried to focus on the film, but the jokes and dialogue sounded distant, muffled, as if I were hearing them underwater. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the sound of the movie. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell anymore. The air in the theater felt heavy, oppressive, and I realized I hadn't heard anything from the projector in a while. The screen was still playing the movie, but the sound had faded to a low hum. That's when I noticed it, movement out of the corner of my eye. One of the figures was now in the aisle, closer to me. I froze, gripping the armrests of my seat. Slowly, I turned my head. The figure was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Another figure moved, stepping closer. Then another. And another. I bolted. My legs felt weak, but adrenaline drove me forward, up the aisle and toward the exit. I didn't dare look back. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing, the slap of my sneakers against the sticky floor. The hallway outside the theater was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows. The lobby was just ahead. I ran for the glass doors, slamming them open and bursting into the cold, wet night. Rain pelted my face as I stumbled onto the street. I turned back, expecting to see the figures following me, but the theater was dark. The marquee was off, the doors shut, and the building looked abandoned, as if it hadn't been open in years. I stood there, drenched and trembling, trying to catch my breath. My ticket was still in my pocket, the ink smudged from the rain. It read screen 6 midnight showing, but I'd been there in the afternoon. When I checked my phone, the clock read 2 in the morning. I haven't gone back to that theater. I don't even know if it still exists. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of those silent figures, standing in the dark, waiting. The late bus. The bus stop was desolate, just a lonely bench beneath a flickering streetlight. I had missed the last scheduled bus by minutes, and the next one wasn't due for an hour. The chill of the evening bit through my jacket as I checked my phone, hoping for a ride share. No signal. A faint rumble in the distance caught my attention. The distinct sound of an approaching bus grew louder, and soon headlights emerged from the darkness. Odd, I thought. The schedule hadn't shown another bus for some time. Still, I stepped closer, relieved. The bus rolled to a stop with a low hiss of its brakes. It was an older model, with scratched windows and peeling paint. The marquee above the windshield was blank, but the doors opened with a mechanical groan, inviting me in. The driver was an older man, his face pale and expressionless under the harsh interior light. He didn't acknowledge me as I swiped my card, only staring straight ahead. I found a seat near the middle, clutching my bag tightly. There were other passengers, but something about them felt off. A woman in a faded coat sat near the front, staring out the window, her face eerily still. A man in a suit clutched a briefcase, his head bowed as if in deep thought. No one spoke. No one moved. The engine hummed softly as the bus pulled away, and I settled into my seat, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Outside, the city's usual glow seemed dimmer, the streets quieter. I couldn't recognize the route. We were turning down roads I'd never seen before, narrower and darker with each passing moment. I glanced at my phone again. Still no signal. My reflection stared back at me from the window, pale and distorted, blending with the shadows of the night. The bus stopped abruptly, and I looked up. A man boarded, his footsteps heavy on the metal steps. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but his presence sent a chill through me. He didn't pay, didn't acknowledge the driver, just walked down the aisle and sat directly behind me. I felt the weight of his presence, the faint sound of his breathing. I wanted to turn and look at him, but something told me not to. My fingers gripped my bag tighter. The bus resumed its journey, the road outside now completely unfamiliar. The streetlights were fewer, their dim glow barely piercing the darkness. I noticed the other passengers shifting slightly, their heads turning, ever so slowly, toward me. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, like mannequins brought to life. Panic bubbled in my chest. I pressed the stop button, the ding echoing loudly in the eerie silence, but the driver didn't react. The bus kept moving, faster now, the engine roaring as the vehicle barreled down the empty road. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice trembling. "I need to get off." The driver didn't respond. Neither did anyone else. I stood, clutching the rail as the bus swayed violently on the uneven road. "Let me off," I shouted, louder this time. The man behind me shifted in his seat. Slowly, I turned my head, unable to resist any longer. He was staring at me. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes impossibly dark. His lips curled into a faint, unnatural smile. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and guttural. The lights in the bus flickered, and the walls seemed to close in. I stumbled backward, gripping the seat for support. The other passengers began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were all wrong, stretched, distorted, as if they were wearing masks made of flesh. The bus stopped suddenly, throwing me off balance. The doors hissed open, revealing nothing but darkness outside. A cold wind rushed in, carrying a faint, metallic smell. "Get out," the man behind me growled. I didn't wait. I ran, leaping off the bus and into the void. My feet hit solid ground, but the darkness was impenetrable. I turned back, but the bus was gone, as if it had never been there. When I finally found my way back to a main road, the city was alive again, the streets buzzing with cars and pedestrians. My phone buzzed in my pocket, full signal now. The time was much later than I thought, hours having slipped away without explanation. I've never taken a bus since that night. I walk now, no matter how far or how late. The hotel room key. I arrived at the hotel late, exhausted from a long day of meetings. The lobby was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the receptionist's computer as she typed something into the system. "Here's your key," she said, sliding a small plastic card across the counter. "Room 143. End of the hall." The elevator ride was slow, each ding echoing in the empty shaft. I leaned against the mirrored wall, rubbing my temples. All I wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before my early morning flight. The hallway on my floor was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for the slightest sound. The patterned carpet muffled my footsteps as I made my way to the end of the corridor. Room 143. I slid the card into the lock, and the light blinked green. The door swung open easily. Inside, the room was typical for a mid-tier hotel: beige walls, a slightly too hard mattress, and a faint scent of industrial cleaner. I threw my bag onto the armchair, kicked off my shoes, and turned on the TV for background noise. The news anchor's droning voice filled the space as I unpacked my toiletries and headed for the bathroom. I stopped short. The bathroom door was ajar, and I could see steam rising from within. The mirror was fogged up, and droplets of water clung to the tiled floor. The shower was running. I froze. My mind raced for an explanation. Housekeeping must have left it on by mistake. That was the only logical answer, wasn't it? But why hadn't they noticed? And why was the water still hot? "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I stepped closer, the sound of the running water filling my ears. My hand trembled as I pushed the door fully open. The shower curtain was drawn, the water cascading behind it. Slowly, I reached out, gripping the edge of the curtain. In one swift motion, I yanked it aside. The tub was empty. The water streamed from the shower head, clear and harmless. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. I turned off the faucet and wiped my damp hands on the nearest towel, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Back in the main room, I double-checked the door to make sure it was locked. It was. I even slid the chain across for good measure. As I sat on the edge of the bed, flipping mindlessly through TV channels, I noticed something odd. My suitcase was no longer on the armchair where I'd left it. It was sitting in the middle of the room, as if it had been deliberately placed there. The air seemed to grow heavier. I stood, glancing around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper. My heart pounded as I moved toward the suitcase. Slowly, I unzipped it. Inside was a single item, a hotel keycard. It wasn't mine. The number printed on it read 144. A loud knock shattered the silence, making me jump. It came from the adjoining door on the far wall, the one that connected to the next room. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it loomed in my vision, slightly ajar. Another knock, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The door creaked open wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, the carpet rough beneath my bare feet. I peered into the adjoining room. It was identical to mine, down to the beige walls and the slightly too hard mattress. But it was empty, devoid of luggage or any sign of occupancy. The only thing out of place was the bathroom door. It was wide open, and steam billowed out, the faint sound of running water echoing from within. I backed away, my pulse hammering. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the front desk, but the screen was frozen. The time hadn't changed since I checked in. A sound behind me made me turn sharply. The door to my room was now wide open, revealing the dimly lit hallway. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my bag and bolted, leaving the door swinging behind me. The elevator took an eternity to arrive, and when it finally did, the mirrored interior showed my reflection, pale, wide-eyed, and utterly alone. At the front desk, I slammed the keycard down. "Room 143, I stammered. "There's something wrong. Someone was in there." The receptionist frowned, tapping at her computer. 143, she repeated, her brow furrowing. "That room's been out of service for weeks. Water damage." I stared at her, my skin crawling. "Then what room did you give me?" She held up my registration slip, the number printed clearly at the top. 144. The train that didn't stop. The platform was deserted, a ghostly place under the flickering fluorescent lights. The train was running late, a rare occurrence for this line, but the announcement had reassured me it was still coming. I checked the time on my watch again. It was well past midnight, and the air was so still it felt like the world had gone to sleep without me. I was the only person waiting. My backpack sat heavy on the bench beside me, stuffed with books and snacks for the long ride home. The silence stretched on, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Then, I heard it, the low, rhythmic rumble of an approaching train. I stood, relief washing over me. The tracks began to vibrate slightly under my feet, and soon, the train appeared, a sleek, dark silhouette against the night. Its headlights pierced the gloom as it slowed, coming into view. But something was off. The train wasn't stopping. I frowned, taking a step closer to the edge of the platform. The train moved slowly, its windows glowing faintly from within, but it didn't halt. I waved, hoping the conductor might see me, but there was no one in the operator's cab. It was empty. The train continued its crawl, and I caught glimpses of the interior through the windows. At first, it seemed like any ordinary train, rows of seats, handrails, and overhead luggage racks. But as it passed, I noticed the passengers. They weren't moving. Each one sat perfectly still, their heads turned toward the windows, faces pale and expressionless. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on something in the distance. One by one, their gazes seemed to meet mine, and a chill ran down my spine. The train slowed even more, the faint sound of its brakes hissing softly, as if taunting me. I could see the final car approaching, its door opened slightly, swinging with the motion of the train. For a moment, I thought I heard whispers, soft, unintelligible voices carried on the night air. The train seemed to hesitate, the final car lingering in front of me. Against all logic, I stepped closer. The open door was inviting in a way I couldn't explain. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words. Come aboard. Join us. I felt an inexplicable pull, a strange compulsion to step inside. My hand reached out almost of its own accord, gripping the cold metal of the rail beside the door. Then I saw it. In the reflection of the window next to the door, I caught a glimpse of myself. But it wasn't quite me. The figure staring back was distorted, its face stretched into an eerie, hollow grin. Its eyes were dark, empty voids, and as I stared, it began to raise a hand, beckoning me inside. I jerked back, my heart pounding, and the train gave a sudden, deafening whistle. The final car began to move again, picking up speed. The door slammed shut, and the whispers faded into the night. I stood frozen, watching as the train disappeared into the distance, its faint red taillights flickering like embers. The platform fell silent once more, and the air seemed impossibly cold. Moments later, the familiar rumble of another train echoed in the distance. This time, when the train pulled into the station, it stopped. The doors slid open with their usual mechanical hiss, and I stepped inside, my hands trembling. The other passengers looked normal, tired but ordinary, and I took a seat near the back. As the train pulled away, I glanced out the window at the tracks we'd left behind. For a brief second, I thought I saw the first train again, motionless on a parallel track. Its windows glowed faintly, and the passengers inside were still staring, their faces pressed against the glass. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the spell. Next stop, he announced, his tone flat and practiced. But as he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had come aboard with me. The phone call. It was late when I finally left the office, the kind of late where the streets were empty and the city seemed to exhale in its sleep. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I approached my car, parked on the far edge of the dimly lit lot. I fished it out, half expecting another email or message about a task I'd left undone. Unknown number. I hesitated. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but something compelled me to swipe the screen. Hello? At first, there was silence. Then a faint crackle, like static from an old radio. Is this you? A voice asked, faint and breathy. Who is this? I demanded, my unease growing. The line went dead. Shaking my head, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and unlocked my car. The small light inside flickered weakly as I slid into the driver's seat. I tossed my bag onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and let the familiar hum of the car settle my nerves. As I pulled onto the road, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I ignored it this time, focusing on the empty street ahead. But the buzzing continued, relentless, until the sound filled the cabin like a swarm of insects. Frustrated, I snatched the phone and answered. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end was different this time, deeper and oddly familiar. "You shouldn't have answered," it said, almost a whisper. "What?" My voice cracked, my pulse racing. "You're not alone," it continued. Check the back seat. A cold wave of terror washed over me. My rearview mirror reflected only darkness, the faint glow of the streetlights doing little to illuminate the space behind me. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I tried to think rationally. It was a prank, it had to be. But I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over my shoulder, the movement slow and reluctant. The back seat was empty. Relief mixed with lingering unease as I turned back to the road. "Nice try," I muttered into the phone, but the line had already gone dead. The rest of the drive was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. My headlights barely seemed to penetrate the darkness ahead, and the familiar streets of my neighborhood felt alien, like a distorted version of themselves. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I stayed in the car for a moment, letting the engine idle. My house stood dark and quiet, the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. Gathering my things, I stepped out and hurried to the front door. Inside, the air felt colder than it should have. I flipped on the lights, dropped my bag, and locked the door behind me, double-checking the deadbolt. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound. I poured myself a glass of water, trying to shake off the lingering unease, when my phone buzzed again. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. Unknown number. My thumb hovered over the screen before I finally swiped to answer. "What?" I snapped. The same deep voice answered, low and deliberate. "It's already inside." The line went dead. Every hair on my body stood on end. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, shifting subtly as if alive. I backed away, my breathing shallow, the phone still clutched tightly in my hand. From somewhere upstairs, I heard a faint creak. My legs refused to move, frozen in place as the sound grew louder, closer, like slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. The last thing I remembered before the lights went out was the soft hum of my phone vibrating again, its glow the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. The grocery store aisle. It was nearly closing time when I walked into the store, the overhead announcement reminding everyone that they'd be shutting the doors in 10 minutes. I grabbed a basket and headed straight for the cleaning supplies aisle, cursing myself for forgetting to buy detergent earlier in the week. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as I walked, casting faint, jittery shadows. The store was nearly empty, the only sound the squeaky wheel of a lone cart in the next aisle over. My shoes echoed faintly against the polished floor as I scanned the shelves, looking for my usual brand. I turned the corner, stepping into an aisle that seemed impossibly long. It stretched further than I remembered, the shelves towering above me like walls. A chill ran through me. The lights in this section were dimmer, buzzing faintly. I shook it off and moved forward. The detergent I needed was midway down the aisle, sitting alone on the shelf like it was waiting for me. I grabbed it, dropped it into my basket, and turned to leave. That's when I saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the aisle, her back to me. She was still, too still, as if she were a mannequin someone had forgotten to put away. Her head tilted slightly to one side, long dark hair obscuring her face. Excuse me, I called out, my voice shaky in the unnerving silence. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, though every instinct told me to turn around and leave. Miss? Are you okay? She moved then, just slightly, a small, almost imperceptible twitch of her shoulders. Her head tilted further, as if she were listening, but still she didn't turn around. My heart pounded in my chest. The air felt thick, suffocating. The lights buzzed louder, and for a moment they dimmed entirely, plunging the aisle into darkness. When they flickered back on, the woman was gone. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe she'd walked away, or maybe I imagined her entirely. I glanced over my shoulder, but the aisle behind me was empty. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate shuffling sound, like bare feet against the polished floor. It was coming from the next aisle over. Gripping my basket like a shield, I crept to the end of the aisle and peeked around the corner. At first, there was nothing. Just rows of neatly stocked canned goods. But then I saw her. She was crouched on the floor now, facing away from me, her hands pressed flat against the tiles. Her hair hung down, obscuring her face as she slowly rocked back and forth. "Do you need help?" I managed to whisper, but my throat was dry and tight. She stopped moving. The silence was unbearable. Suddenly, her head snapped toward me, and I saw her face. Or rather, I saw the absence of it. Her skin was smooth, featureless, devoid of eyes, a nose, or a mouth. My breath caught in my throat as she began to rise, her movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled backward, dropping the basket. The sound of plastic hitting the floor seemed deafening. She took a step forward, then another, her bare feet leaving faint smudges on the polished floor. I turned and ran, my shoes squeaking against the tiles. The store's aisles seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, and no matter how far I ran, the exit stayed maddeningly out of reach. Behind me, I could hear her. The shuffling was faster now, accompanied by a faint, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I burst through the front doors, nearly tripping on the curb outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap, and I spun around, expecting to see her standing there. The store was dark, the lights inside completely off. It was as if the place had been closed for hours. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my heart pounding painfully. My basket, the one I dropped, sat on the curb beside me. The detergent was still inside, along with a crumpled receipt. The reflection in the window. It had been a long day at work, the kind where the hours stretched and bled together, leaving me exhausted and numb. As I walked to my apartment, I noticed the streets were eerily empty for a Thursday evening, and the air felt heavier than usual, as though the city itself were holding its breath. I pulled my coat tighter around me, quickening my pace. The street lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to move just a second too late. I didn't think much of it at first, but the unsettling feeling that had been creeping up on me all day settled into my chest. As I reached my building, I noticed the lobby door was ajar, which was unusual. I glanced around. No one was around, not a sound in the air except the soft hum of traffic from far away. I stepped inside. The building felt unnervingly silent. The elevator was out of order, another oddity, but nothing to be overly concerned about, and I took the stairs to my apartment on the 4th floor. The flickering light in the hallway overhead only added to the atmosphere of disquiet that seemed to be growing around me. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door, when I heard something. A soft tapping, almost like a rhythmic knock, coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one in the hallway. The sound stopped, and I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. I opened the door to my apartment and stepped inside. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. I shrugged it off, trying to push down the sense of unease that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. I set my keys down on the counter, my gaze catching their reflection in the window opposite. For a moment, I froze. There was someone standing behind me. I whipped around, heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty. My breath came in shallow bursts as I turned back to the window, my reflection now showing only me, just as it should have. But something felt off. The reflection lingered just a fraction longer than it should have. I blinked and took a step closer to the window, eyes scanning the glass for anything that could explain what I'd seen. Nothing. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it intensified. My own reflection in the window seemed to shift slightly. My posture was wrong, too rigid, and my face was a shade paler than it should have been. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This was stupid, I told myself. I was just overtired. But the air around me had grown colder, and the reflection in the window began to change. I could see it now more clearly. A figure standing behind me, just out of my line of sight, its features blurry but unmistakably wrong. Its posture was unnatural, as though it were stretching toward me, its arms too long, its face hidden in shadows. My body froze, the fear rising like ice in my veins. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure in the reflection moved, its head tilting to one side in an eerie imitation of curiosity. I turned around again, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room was still empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I faced the window once more, eyes wide. The figure was closer now, so close that I could feel its presence pressing against me, a suffocating weight that filled the room. My reflection smiled, but it wasn't my smile. The eyes were wrong, too dark, too hollow. Then, with a sudden, sharp noise, the figure's hand reached out from the window, its fingers splayed and unnaturally long, grasping for me. I jerked backward, breaking the connection with the window, but the feeling of the hand, cold and unseen, still lingered on my skin. The lights flickered again, and the room plunged into darkness. I stumbled backward, reaching for my phone, but the screen flickered to life on its own before I could touch it. The only thing that appeared on the screen was my reflection, grinning back at me. A message popped up, "Let me in." I dropped the phone, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The power cut out completely. In the pitch-black darkness, I heard something moving. Soft, slow footsteps that echoed throughout my apartment. I wasn't alone. The unseen passenger. It was a typical Tuesday evening when I left work, tired and eager to get home. The streets were calm, the sky a dark canvas filled with scattered clouds, and the familiar hum of the city felt oddly distant. I walked to my car, parked on the far side of the lot. The air had a strange chill to it, despite the fact that it wasn't particularly cold. I brushed it off as nothing more than the exhaustion settling into my bones. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Empty. The car was quiet, just the faint hum of the engine as I turned the key. I drove out of the lot, the streetlights casting long, sharp shadows on the pavement. The roads were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. I always took the same route home, a familiar, straightforward drive through the city and then onto the quieter back roads. It was peaceful, almost meditative. But tonight, something felt different. The usual comfort of the drive had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of unease that clung to the edges of my mind. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, just out of habit. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me, but when I checked, the back seat was empty. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I tried to shake the feeling off. The road ahead stretched out into the darkness, the headlights illuminating only a few feet of the asphalt. As I approached a sharp bend, I noticed something strange, a car ahead, parked by the side of the road. It was an old sedan, its engine running but with no one around. There was something about it that made me feel uneasy, a feeling I couldn't quite place. I passed it, trying to push the thought away. But then, I saw something else. In the corner of my eye, a fleeting movement. I jerked my gaze back to the rearview mirror and froze. There was someone in the back seat. My heart dropped. The figure was sitting perfectly still, slumped against the door. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadowy outline. It was as if they had been there all along, hidden from my view until now. Panic surged through me. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching as I pulled over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I turned to look behind me. The back seat was empty. No one there. I stared at the empty seat for a long moment, trying to calm my breathing. I was just tired, I told myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like the shifting of fabric. I whipped my head around, but the back seat was still empty. The rustling continued, growing louder, more insistent. I could feel my heart racing, my palms slick with sweat. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I needed to get out of the car. I needed to escape. Before I could open the door, the rustling stopped. And then I heard a voice, low and strained, as if it were coming from far away. "Let me out." I froze. The voice was barely a whisper, but it felt as if it were right next to me. My blood ran cold. I turned back to the rearview mirror, my eyes wide with terror. The figure was there again, clearer now. The face, pale and gaunt, was pressed against the window. The eyes were dark, hollow, like black holes that stared directly into me. A thin, crooked smile curled across its lips. I screamed and flung open the door, rushing out of the car and into the cold night. My feet stumbled as I ran, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I kept running, not daring to look back. By the time I reached the nearest streetlight, I stopped, gasping for breath. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the car, no figure in the back seat. The street was empty, quiet. I must have imagined it. It had to be my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, still shaking, and saw an unfamiliar number. I answered without thinking, my voice shaky. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. And then, Just before the call ended, I heard it. The same voice, barely audible. "Let me in." The missing key. The office was nearly empty when I left, the usual hum of voices replaced by a quiet, almost oppressive silence. It was late, well past the time most people had gone home. I was just finishing up some last-minute paperwork, preparing to leave for the night. My coat hung over the back of my chair, and I grabbed it, wrapping it around my shoulders as I headed toward the elevator. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the floor. I didn't think much of it. It had been a long day, and I was too tired to pay attention to such minor details. I pressed the button for the elevator, glancing around as I waited. That's when I saw it, something on the floor. A key. It was lying next to the elevator, just outside the doors. I hadn't noticed it before, and I was certain no one had been here recently. The office was so quiet that even the faintest sound seemed amplified, and there was no one else around. I bent down and picked it up. It was a simple, brass key, no markings, just plain and unremarkable. I stared at it for a moment, a strange unease washing over me. But it wasn't as if I could leave it lying there. I slipped the key into my pocket, deciding to deal with it later. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside. The air inside was cool, and the gentle hum of the elevator's machinery was oddly comforting. I pressed the button for the ground floor and leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment. The elevator began its descent, but then it jerked to a stop. My eyes snapped open. I checked the display. The elevator had stopped between floors, somewhere in the middle of the building. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. I pressed every button, but none of them lit up. A sinking feeling started to rise in my chest. Something wasn't right. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, plunging the small space into darkness for a second before they returned. I could feel my heart begin to race, the claustrophobia setting in as the seconds stretched into minutes. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Suddenly, I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to face the corner of the elevator, though I couldn't see anything in the dim light. The scraping continued, growing louder, closer. It sounded as if someone, was moving, just out of view. I pressed myself against the elevator wall, my skin crawling, the cold metal pressing into my back. Then I heard it again, clearer this time, an unmistakable sound of breathing. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone was standing right next to me, just beyond my reach. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling in the stillness. Nothing. I gripped the sides of the elevator, trying to steady myself. My mind raced with possible explanations, but none of them made sense. I was alone, wasn't I? There couldn't be anyone else in here. The breathing grew louder, ragged now, as if whoever was there was getting closer. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the emergency button. But when my hand brushed the panel, I froze. There, on the edge of the elevator floor, was the same key I had found earlier, lying there as if it had never left my pocket. I bent down to pick it up, but the moment I touched it, the scraping sound stopped. The breathing, too, ceased. A quiet laugh echoed through the darkness, soft and cruel. My breath hitched as I stood, the key still clutched in my hand. My fingers felt cold as ice against the brass, and I turned it over, inspecting it more carefully. It was not plain, not unremarkable. There was something etched into the side, faint, barely visible in the dim light. I squinted at it, trying to make out the words. The message read, "You're not alone." Before I could process what was happening, the elevator jolted to life. The doors opened to a floor I didn't recognize, a floor I knew wasn't on the building directory. I stepped out cautiously, but as soon as I did, the doors slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside the building. I stood in the empty hallway, staring at the dimly lit corridor ahead. I wanted to turn back, but the faint sound of movement from the shadows stopped me. Someone, or something, was watching me. The key still burned cold on my palm. I could feel the walls closing in, the sensation of eyes on my back, but no matter where I turned, there was nothing but the empty hallway stretching on forever. I wasn't sure if I'd ever leave this place. But one thing was certain, the key had already unlocked something. And whatever was waiting here, it wasn't finished with me. The uninvited guest. The sky was heavy with the weight of an impending storm as I made my way down the quiet street. It had been one of those days, mundane, ordinary, with nothing to suggest that it would end in anything other than the usual peace of home. The kind of day where you walk in a trance, your mind lost in 1,000 thoughts, only half aware of the world around you. I reached my apartment building, the familiar entrance in front of me. I was tired, my body aching from the long hours of work, and all I wanted was to collapse onto my couch. I swiped my keycard to unlock the door and stepped into the dimly lit lobby. The air inside smelled stale, a mix of old carpet and cleaning supplies. I could hear the faint hum of the elevator in the distance, but I preferred the stairs. Something about the silence of the staircase, the way the creaky steps seemed to echo in the empty space, made me feel less exposed. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached my floor, I took out my keys and unlocked my door. The familiar click of the lock was a small comfort, a signal that I was home. I stepped inside, kicking off my shoes, and closed the door behind me. The apartment was just as I had left it, quiet, still, nothing out of place. I tossed my bag onto the counter and walked into the living room. The soft glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat down on the couch and reached for the remote, but then something made me stop. There was a faint noise. A soft rustling, like paper being shuffled. It came from the kitchen. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't left anything in the kitchen. The apartment had been empty all day. I waited, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, clearer. A deliberate sound, like someone was moving around in the kitchen. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. I crept toward the kitchen, my feet barely making a sound on the floor. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension. The overhead light flickered once before casting a weak, uneven glow across the room. There was no one there. No one, but the sink was running. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening, and turned the faucet off. The water had been running for a while, judging by the dampness around the sink. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Had I left it on this morning? But before I could think any more about it, I noticed something strange on the counter. A piece of paper. It was folded neatly, and it hadn't been there before. My hands were trembling as I reached for it, unfolding it slowly. The message was written in a precise, clean hand. "I'm here. Come find me." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the words. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message seemed so personal. It felt like it was meant for me, like someone was watching, waiting. My mind raced. I must be imagining things. This had to be some kind of prank, right? But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the fear crept in. The apartment was locked. No one had entered since I came in. But there it was, the message, as real as anything else in my world. Then I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible creak, like someone was standing in the hallway outside. I turned toward the door, my stomach twisting into knots. For a moment, I debated whether to call the police. But what would I say? Someone left a note? There was no way to explain what I was feeling, like someone, or something, was right there, just beyond the door, waiting for me to make the next move. I approached the door cautiously, trying to steady my breath. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The silence in the apartment was unbearable. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just the dull hum of the building's lights flickering overhead. But there was something new, something I hadn't noticed before. A shadow. Just at the edge of the hallway, near the staircase. A figure, unmoving. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape seemed wrong. It was too tall, too thin. The longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to distort, its edges blurring and shifting as if it were made of smoke, not flesh. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my chest. My mind screamed at me to close the door, to lock it and never look back. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, my breath catching in my throat. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, like it had been waiting for me to react. The shadow in the hallway shifted, its shape elongating, growing taller, until I could hear the soft padding of footsteps approaching. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing as I bolted the lock. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the door, my breath shallow and quick. What was happening? Who was that? Why was I being hunted? There was no answer. Only the sound of my heart beating louder and louder in my ears. The dark reflection. It was past midnight when I finally arrived home. The usual hum of the city had dimmed to a distant murmur, and the streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car or late-night wanderer. I wasn't tired, not in the way that sleep could fix. More like the exhaustion that comes from the weight of a long, unremarkable day dragging on. I didn't want to go straight to bed. I just needed a moment to settle, to feel like the day was over. I turned the key in the door, the click of the lock almost comforting in its familiarity. The apartment greeted me with its usual stillness. The quiet was a relief after a day filled with noise, meetings, phone calls, constant movement. I set my things down, slipped off my shoes, and walked toward the living room. The lights were dim, casting long shadows against the walls, and everything seemed just a bit too still. A strange unease crept over me, but I dismissed it. It was just the exhaustion. As I passed the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself, just a brief flash of movement, the outline of my own reflection, but something was off. I stopped. Something in the mirror wasn't quite right. I turned to face it fully, watching my own image. The reflection seemed normal, but there was something unsettling about the way the shadows on my face appeared, deeper, more pronounced, like it was too dark in the room. The reflection blinked. My stomach tightened, I blinked and it was gone. The image was just a normal reflection again, nothing out of place. But my heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. Something I hadn't imagined. I stepped closer to the mirror. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I stared into the glass, the unease turned to something heavier. The light in the room seemed to flicker, and I watched as the shadows in the mirror grew darker, more defined. It wasn't right. I turned away, telling myself it was nothing. I walked into the kitchen, trying to shake the feeling, but my mind kept drifting back to that moment in the mirror. The way my reflection had moved, almost as if it were waiting. As I opened the fridge to grab some water, the light above me flickered again, and I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faintest whisper, coming from the hallway. I froze. I wasn't alone. My pulse quickened, and I set the bottle down, straining to listen. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, low and indistinct, like it was coming from right behind me. I turned slowly, but the hallway was empty. The silence stretched on for a few seconds before I felt it, the unmistakable feeling of eyes on me. I felt it on my back, my neck, even though no one was there. I took a hesitant step toward the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper came again, louder now, but still impossible to understand. I could feel the hair on my arms stand up, a cold chill spreading through me. I turned back to the hallway mirror. My reflection was there, as it should be. But then, it moved. Not in the way I did. It didn't mimic my actions. Instead, it looked directly at me, its eyes dark and hollow, the shadows under its gaze deep and shifting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection grinned, a wide, eerie smile that wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror raised its hand and pointed to the door at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't me. I stepped back, heart racing. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I turned toward the door, toward the direction the reflection had pointed. There was no way to explain what I was seeing. But something was there. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling, but as I touched the screen, I noticed the time. It was now 2 hours later than when I had first entered the apartment. The sudden realization sent a wave of dread crashing over me. How had time passed so quickly? What had happened to those lost moments? I walked toward the door, every instinct telling me to turn and run, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what was in the hallway. I opened the door, my breath shallow as I stepped into the dark, empty space. The air was cold, thick with an unsettling stillness. The apartment, though, was eerily silent. Not a sound. Then, just as I was about to close the door behind me, I heard it again. The whisper. Louder, clearer this time. You're still here. I spun around, and there, standing in the middle of the hallway, was the reflection. But it wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real. It was standing there, its hollow eyes locked on mine, the grin still plastered across its face. Before I could react, it lunged at me, faster than I could comprehend, its cold hands wrapping around my throat. The last thing I saw before the world went black was my own face, smiling back at me in the hallway mirror. The lost key. I had never been to this part of town before. The streets were narrow and twisted, lined with old buildings that seemed to lean toward each other, like they were holding secrets in their crumbling brick walls. The sun had just set, and the fading light painted the buildings in shades of orange and purple. It was the kind of place where, if you didn't know where you were going, you could easily get lost. But I wasn't lost. I was just curious. I had been walking for about 15 minutes when I saw it, a small, unmarked door nestled between two shops. It was strange, as if it didn't belong there. The door was too old for the modern buildings around it. The paint was peeling, and the wood was warped, but it had a certain pull to it. Something about it felt like it was waiting for me. I walked toward it, feeling an odd sense of anticipation. I didn't know what I expected to find behind that door, but I had to know. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, unsure, before I pushed it open. The door creaked, revealing a narrow hallway that stretched further than I had imagined. It was dimly lit by a flickering light at the end. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled stale, like something had been locked away for years. I could hear my own footsteps echoing off the walls as I made my way toward the light. The deeper I walked, the colder it seemed to get, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as if the place itself were holding its breath. I reached the end of the hallway and found myself standing in front of another door, this one even older than the first. The wood was cracked, and the handle was tarnished. There was something about it, though, that made me feel like I had to open it. I reached for the handle, and as I did, I felt it, a faint vibration, like something was moving just on the other side. It was brief, barely perceptible, but enough to make my heart race. I opened the door. Inside was a small room, barely large enough to hold a table and a few chairs. The walls were lined with shelves, all filled with dusty old books. There was a single window at the far end of the room, but it was covered with thick curtains that blocked out any light from outside. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent light above. But it wasn't the room itself that made my skin crawl. It was what I found on the table. There, in the center of the room, was a small, tarnished key. It was ordinary at first glance, but something about it seemed wrong. The way it glinted in the dim light, the way it seemed to call out to me. It was just a key, but it felt like it belonged to something I wasn't supposed to find. I reached for it. The moment my fingers brushed against the metal, a loud bang echoed through the room, and the door slammed shut behind me. My heart stopped as I spun around, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room was suddenly suffocating. The air felt thick, as if it were pressing on me from all sides. I tried to pull at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. I had to leave. I turned back to the table, my hands trembling as I gripped the key. It was heavier now, like it was pulling me towards something. But what? I didn't have time to think. A sharp, cold draft cut through the room, and the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath formed visible clouds in the air as I backed away from the table. The sound of the wind howling outside filled the room, and then the whispering began. It was faint at first, like the rustling of paper in the wind. But then the voices grew louder, clearer. They were soft at first, but then they grew frantic, urgent. You shouldn't have taken it. The words seemed to come from every direction, wrapping around me, seeping into my thoughts. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to leave. I had to escape before. A figure appeared in the doorway, blocking my only escape. It was tall, thin, and draped in shadows, its face obscured by the darkness. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them. Watching. Waiting. The whispers grew louder. You shouldn't have taken it. You can't leave now. I stumbled back, the key slipping from my hand and clattering onto the floor. The figure took a slow step toward me, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. I turned and ran. I bolted for the door, throwing myself against it, but it wouldn't open. The figure was closer now, its breath cold against my neck. I screamed, pounding my fists against the door. It wouldn't give. It wouldn't let me out. And then, suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. The figure was gone. The door creaked open. I stepped out into the hallway, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The hallway stretched out in front of me, empty and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The room, the key, it was all gone. I didn't know what had just occurred. But I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't supposed to be here. And whatever I had taken, whatever I had found, was never meant to be mine. The unseen passenger. I had just finished my shift at the restaurant and was looking forward to heading home. The late night shift always left me drained, and it was already past 2 in the morning. The streets were nearly empty, just the occasional car passing by, its headlights cutting through the fog that had rolled in. I was used to the quiet of the late hours, the stillness that settled over the city, but tonight, something felt different. I waited at the bus stop, the streetlights casting long, yellow shadows across the pavement. The bus was supposed to arrive in a few minutes, but the delay felt longer than usual. I glanced around. The street was empty, no one else was waiting at the stop. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, feeling the chill in the air seep through. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. It was a message from my friend Sarah. You still on your way? I replied quickly, yeah, just waiting for the bus. Almost there. I didn't bother telling her how strange it felt, standing here alone at this hour, waiting for something as mundane as a bus. The bus finally came into view, its headlights cutting through the mist like a beam of light in a dark tunnel. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I boarded, the doors opening with a hiss, and found a seat near the back. The bus was almost completely empty, save for a few scattered passengers. The driver nodded at me as I settled into the seat, and I returned a brief smile before looking out the window. The streets outside passed by in a blur, the city gradually giving way to quieter, darker neighborhoods. My eyes started to feel heavy, the exhaustion of the night creeping in. I closed them for a moment, just for a second. When I opened them again, I noticed something. There was a figure sitting across from me, in the seat on the other side of the aisle. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes, but no. It was there. A man, hunched over, his face hidden in the hood of a long coat. His hands rested on his lap, fingers twitching slightly as if they were moving to an unheard rhythm. I felt a chill run through me, a prickle at the back of my neck. It was just one of those things, right? One of those moments where you think you saw something but didn't really see it at all. But as the bus made another stop, I noticed something strange. No one got on. No one got off. The man was still there. I shifted in my seat, trying not to stare. But it was impossible. His presence filled the space between us, an unsettling weight that I couldn't ignore. I could feel his gaze, though I couldn't see his eyes. It was like he was looking right at me, even though his head was slightly bowed. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized something. He wasn't moving. Not in the usual way people do. His body was still, unnaturally still. His fingers twitched again, and my heart skipped a beat. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed. But the bus remained eerily quiet. The other passengers were oblivious, their heads down, staring at their phones or lost in their own worlds. A wave of unease washed over me. I glanced at the bus driver through the rearview mirror. He seemed normal, unaffected, his eyes fixed on the road. That's when I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, like the sound of someone shifting in their seat. But it wasn't coming from the man. It was coming from the seat next to me. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone get on, and there was no one sitting next to me. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The seat beside me was empty, but there was a distinct, almost imperceptible indentation in the fabric. Like someone had been sitting there. I turned back to the man across the aisle. His head was raised now, just enough to reveal his face. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. His eyes were hollow, dark pools, his skin pale and stretched too tightly over his bones. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he opened his mouth. The words came out like a rasp, barely a whisper, but they sent a jolt through my chest. "You're not alone." Before I could react, I felt it, a cold pressure against my side. The sensation of someone leaning over me. My heart pounded, and I gasped, my hand flying to my phone, trying to call for help, but the screen was flickering, unresponsive. The rustling sound came again, this time louder, as if someone was shifting right next to me. My breath quickened, panic setting in. I could feel the weight of someone pressing down beside me, but when I turned, the seat was still empty. The bus lurched to a stop, and the doors opened with a creak. I didn't wait. I bolted out of my seat, stumbling as I made my way to the exit. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and light, following me. But when I turned, no one was there. I rushed off the bus, the cool night air hitting my face as I stumbled onto the sidewalk, my heart still racing. The bus doors closed with a hiss, and the engine roared to life, pulling away into the fog. I stood there, my legs trembling, watching the bus disappear into the mist. I turned around and looked back at the street. It was empty now, completely still. Except for the figure standing by the lamppost across the street, watching me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. The forgotten locker. I was already running late when I reached the gym. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their flickering casting brief shadows across the dull gray walls. The gym was almost empty at this hour, the late evening crowd having long since disappeared. I wasn't in the mood for a workout, but I had forgotten to lock up my locker earlier, and I couldn't risk leaving my things unattended. As I walked through the entrance, the air was thick with the smell of rubber mats and sweat, a familiar scent that seemed to linger long after the last person left. I made my way past the few remaining gym goers, a couple of men working out near the weights, their grunts the only sound breaking the silence. I didn't even glance at them, my mind focused on getting to my locker, getting out, and heading home. I reached the locker area and slid my keycard through the lock. The locker opened with a soft click, revealing my gym bag, my phone, and my water bottle, everything as I'd left it. But something was wrong. There was a faint smell in the air, like damp fabric or something musty. I frowned. It wasn't the usual smell of the gym. I glanced around but saw no one. The locker room was empty, save for the two men still in the weights section, their silhouettes casting long shadows across the floor. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing my things. That's when I noticed it. The lock on the locker next to mine was slightly ajar. I hadn't remembered leaving it open, but maybe I had. It wasn't unheard of to forget something like that, especially with my mind racing to get out of the gym. Still, I found myself staring at it for a moment too long. I shrugged it off and grabbed my stuff, but just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure. In the reflection of the metal locker door across from me, there was someone standing in the far corner of the locker room. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe one of the men from the weights section, but it wasn't. The figure was still, unmoving. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but I could see the shape of a person hunched over slightly, like they were trying to hide in the corner. A cold chill ran down my spine, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. My body felt frozen, like I was trapped in place. I glanced at the exit. It wasn't far, but the figure, something about it didn't feel right. I could feel my heart rate pick up as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I took a step forward, then another, my shoes scuffing softly against the floor. The figure didn't move. I hesitated again, feeling my stomach twist in knots. The locker room was too quiet. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. Just the soft buzzing of the lights above, the air stale with the scent of cleaning supplies. I took a deep breath and moved toward the exit. The closer I got, the more I felt the weight of someone's presence. I looked back once more, my mind racing, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But then, I saw it. The figure was no longer in the corner. It was closer now, standing just behind one of the tall lockers. The only thing I could see were dark, shifting shapes in the shadows. I felt the panic rise in my chest, and my pulse quickened. I could hear the soft shuffle of feet across the floor, getting closer, but when I turned to look, no one was there. I turned around quickly and made my way to the exit, but as I did, the lights overhead flickered again. The locker room felt colder now, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I reached for the door, but just before I could pull it open, I heard it. A soft thud. Like something had been dropped, or someone had moved in the shadows. I turned toward the sound instinctively, my eyes scanning the darkened space behind me. But again, I saw nothing. The door clicked open, and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I stepped into the hallway, breathing heavily, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. My legs felt heavy, as if they were made of stone, but I forced myself to move, to keep going. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face. I stood there for a few moments, taking in the quiet, the stillness of the world around me. It felt like I had just escaped something, though I couldn't explain why. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and started walking toward my car, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced behind me once more. The gym's windows were dark now, but I swear, for just a moment, I saw a figure standing in the window. The chill crawled up my spine once more. The forgotten locker. I was already running late when I reached the gym. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their flickering casting brief shadows across the dull gray walls. The gym was almost empty at this hour, the late evening crowd having long since disappeared. I wasn't in the mood for a workout, but I had forgotten to lock up my locker earlier, and I couldn't risk leaving my things unattended. As I walked through the entrance, the air was thick with the smell of rubber mats and sweat, a familiar scent that seemed to linger long after the last person left. I made my way past the few remaining gym goers, a couple of men working out near the weights, their grunts the only sound breaking the silence. I didn't even glance at them, my mind focused on getting to my locker, getting out, and heading home. I reached the locker area and slid my keycard through the lock. The locker opened with a soft click, revealing my gym bag, my phone, and my water bottle, everything as I'd left it. But something was wrong. There was a faint smell in the air, like damp fabric or something musty. I frowned. It wasn't the usual smell of the gym. I glanced around but saw no one. The locker room was empty, save for the two men still in the weights section, their silhouettes casting long shadows across the floor. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing my things. That's when I noticed it. The lock on the locker next to mine was slightly ajar. I hadn't remembered leaving it open, but maybe I had. It wasn't unheard of to forget something like that, especially with my mind racing to get out of the gym. Still, I found myself staring at it for a moment too long. I shrugged it off and grabbed my stuff, but just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure. In the reflection of the metal locker door across from me, there was someone standing in the far corner of the locker room. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe one of the men from the weights section, but it wasn't. The figure was still, unmoving. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but I could see the shape of a person, hunched over slightly, like they were trying to hide in the corner. A cold chill ran down my spine, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. My body felt frozen, like I was trapped in place. I glanced at the exit. It wasn't far, but the figure, something about it didn't feel right. I could feel my heart rate pick up as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I took a step forward, then another, my shoes scuffing softly against the floor. The figure didn't move. I hesitated again, feeling my stomach twist in knots. The locker room was too quiet. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. Just the soft buzzing of the lights above, the air stale with the scent of cleaning supplies. I took a deep breath and moved toward the exit. The closer I got, the more I felt the weight of someone's presence. I looked back once more, my mind racing, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But then, I saw it. The figure was no longer in the corner. It was closer now, standing just behind one of the tall lockers. The only thing I could see were dark, shifting shapes in the shadows. I felt the panic rise in my chest, and my pulse quickened. I could hear the soft shuffle of feet across the floor, getting closer, but when I turned to look, no one was there. I turned around quickly and made my way to the exit, but as I did, the lights overhead flickered again. The locker room felt colder now, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I reached for the door, but just before I could pull it open, I heard it. A soft thud. Like something had been dropped, or someone had moved in the shadows. I turned toward the sound instinctively, my eyes scanning the darkened space behind me. But again, I saw nothing. The door clicked open, and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I stepped into the hallway, breathing heavily, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. My legs felt heavy, as if they were made of stone, but I forced myself to move, to keep going. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face. I stood there for a few moments, taking in the quiet, the stillness of the world around me. It felt like I had just escaped something, though I couldn't explain why. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and started walking toward my car, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced behind me once more. The gym's windows were dark now, but I swear, for just a moment, I saw a figure standing in the window. The chill crawled up my spine once more. The late package. I was sitting at my desk, trying to wrap up the last of my work for the day. The office was nearly empty, just me and a few other stragglers who had yet to finish their shifts. The sound of keyboards clicking and the faint hum of the printer were the only things breaking the silence. It was just past 7 in the evening, and the streetlights outside had already flickered to life. The office building was always quiet at night, the kind of quiet that starts to feel heavy, like the walls are pressing in on you. I was tired, but I wanted to finish a report before I left. The clock on my computer screen ticked over to 7:30, and I knew I had another half hour before the building would be officially locked up for the night. I didn't mind staying a little late, but I was looking forward to getting home. Then, just as I was about to click save on my report, I heard a knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the white noise of the office. I glanced up from my screen, but no one was at the door. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the sound of the wind outside or the old building settling. But then, I heard it again, louder this time. A single knock, followed by a brief silence. I got up and walked to the door, wondering if maybe one of my coworkers had come back for something they'd forgotten. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. There wasn't a soul in sight. I stepped out into the corridor, looking both ways. No one. The building seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, the low hum of fluorescent lights above the only indication that it wasn't completely deserted. I felt a brief, inexplicable chill run down my spine. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, the building was old, and the pipes sometimes made strange noises. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the silence. Just then, I noticed a small package sitting on the floor near the corner of the hallway. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no label, no return address. It wasn't there before. I would have noticed it. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced back toward my office door, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the corner, laughing at my reaction. But no one appeared. I took a step closer to the package, bending down cautiously to inspect it. The paper was crinkled, as though it had been sitting there for a while. There was no indication of who had left it, or why. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and as I held it, I felt an unease. Why would a package be left here? Who would leave something like this in a building that was practically empty at this hour? I turned it over in my hands, trying to find some clue, but there was nothing. Just plain brown paper, sealed with tape. That's when the phone rang. I nearly dropped the package in surprise, my heart hammering in my chest. I quickly pulled my phone out of my pocket, my fingers trembling. The number was blocked. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding far more nervous than I intended. There was no answer, just silence on the other end. I waited, my breath shallow. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone moving in the background. And then, barely audible, a voice whispered, "Open it." I froze. My mind raced. Who was this? Why were they telling me to open the package? "Hello?" I said again, louder this time, but the line went dead. I stood there, staring at my phone, unsure of what to do next. The hallway around me felt colder now, the silence more oppressive. The lights above flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. I looked back at the package in my hands, still unsure of what to make of it. Was it a prank? Someone from work messing with me? But the voice on the phone didn't sound like a joke. It felt wrong, like it came from somewhere else entirely. And the rustling, it sounded too close. I glanced around again, half expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. But no one came. My hand hovered over the package, my mind screaming at me to just leave it, to walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it. But my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a pair of scissors from my desk drawer, still watching the hallway nervously. My pulse raced as I cut through the tape, the sound of the blade slicing through the paper too loud in the silence. My hands were shaking, and I tried to focus, tried to keep my mind clear as I peeled back the layers of paper. Inside, there was a small, black box. It was simple, unmarked, with no distinguishing features. My heart pounded harder now, a sense of dread creeping over me. I opened the box slowly, my fingers trembling. Inside was a key. It was old-fashioned, heavy, with intricate engravings on the metal. My stomach twisted as I stared at it. There was no note, no explanation. Just a key. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, I heard it again, another knock. It came from the direction of the stairwell, louder this time, more insistent. I turned toward the sound, my hand tightening around the key. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of everything. Who had left the package? Why was I being told to open it? And what was I supposed to do with the key? A voice whispered again, this time clearer, almost in my ear, "You'll need it soon." The lights flickered one last time before going out entirely, plunging the building into darkness. The flickering light. I had been on my feet all day, but I had one last stop to make before heading home. The bookstore I worked at was a small, quiet place, tucked away on a side street. It had a kind of charm, with its creaky wooden floors, the smell of coffee and old pages lingering in the air. I wasn't a fan of closing up alone at night, but it was part of the job. There was something unnerving about the quietness that settled in as soon as the last customer left, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional creak of the building settling. It had been a fairly slow day, but I'd just finished reorganizing the nonfiction section, and I was ready to call it a night. As I walked toward the front door, I noticed something odd. The overhead light flickered. It wasn't unusual for the lights to flicker occasionally, given the building's age, but tonight it was different. The flicker lasted longer than usual, as though the light was trying to tell me something. I glanced around the store, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The usual sense of isolation that came with closing time felt heavier tonight, like the building itself was holding its breath. I sighed, shrugged it off, and went to lock the door. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound. It came from the back of the store, near the storage room where we kept the extra stock. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the empty bookstore, it was clear enough. My heart skipped a beat. I froze for a moment, listening. There was no one else in the store, not that I could see. I had locked the door when I arrived, and no one had come in since. But the sound was unmistakable, a faint rustling, as if someone were shuffling around behind the shelves. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what it could be. Maybe it was just the wind outside, or the settling of the building, but something about it didn't feel right. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer beneath the counter and turned it on, stepping cautiously toward the back of the store. My heart was pounding now, and every footstep I took seemed to echo louder than the last. As I moved further into the store, I glanced up at the flickering light above, its glow dimming and brightening in an erratic pattern. It cast strange shadows on the walls, making the aisles look almost alive. When I reached the back, the sound stopped. I stood there, still, my breath shallow. The silence was deafening. There was no sign of anyone, no indication that anyone had been in the store, other than that faint noise. The storage room door was closed, just as it had been when I left earlier. I took a deep breath and opened it, the creaking of the door echoing louder than it should have. I stepped inside, scanning the shelves filled with unopened boxes and extra stock. Nothing looked out of place. But that feeling, the one you get when you know you're being watched, was still there. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard something else. A soft thud. It came from the far corner of the storage room. I spun around, my pulse quickening, but there was nothing there. Only a few old crates stacked in the corner, casting long shadows in the dim light. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. As I started to walk back toward the front of the store, I noticed something strange. The door to the street, which had been locked earlier, was now slightly ajar. Not enough for anyone to have snuck in unnoticed, but it was open just enough for the faintest draft to slip through, causing the hair on my neck to stand on end. I approached it slowly, hesitant, my hand brushing against the cool metal of the doorframe. I glanced outside, but the street was empty, lit only by the distant glow of a street lamp. I stepped closer, but as I reached for the door to close it, I heard it again. A soft rustling, closer this time. I spun around, but the store was still empty. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, like the walls were closing in around me. The flickering light overhead was getting worse, flashing sporadically like a signal. The longer I stood there, the more I felt as if the very air in the room was thick with something unseen, something that didn't belong. I turned to face the counter, trying to steady myself, but when I did, I noticed something on the counter that hadn't been there before. A book. It was an old, tattered hardcover, something I didn't recognize. Its cover was a faded dark green, with no title, just an intricate pattern of lines and shapes that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. The book was open to a random page, the pages yellowed with age. I felt my pulse race again. I didn't remember seeing the book there before, and I definitely hadn't left it out when I'd been tidying up. I glanced around the store once more, but there was no sign of anyone, no explanation for how it had gotten there. The door was still slightly ajar, and the rustling sound was now unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere inside the store. I stepped toward the book, my hand shaking as I reached out to close it. But just as my fingers brushed against the pages, I heard a low, creaking sound like the old wooden floorboards underfoot. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before, and it was getting closer, the weight of each step seeming to grow heavier. My eyes darted around the store, but there was still no one there. The light overhead flickered one last time, and the store plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the pitch-black room. The forgotten shift. I had just finished a late-night meeting at the office. The team had wrapped up everything, and I was left to finalize some last-minute paperwork. It was close to 11:30, The usual quiet that settled in once everyone else had gone home was now taking over. The building was mostly empty. I could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning system, and the flicker of fluorescent lights overhead seemed to add to the eerie calm. I had worked in this office for a few years now, and though I was familiar with every hallway, every turn, there was something about tonight that felt different. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the stress of a long day, but as I sat at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I just started on the last report of the night when I heard it. A noise. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A faint tapping sound coming from down the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the building settling or the sound of someone else still working on a different floor. But as I sat there, listening more closely, it became apparent that the tapping was irregular, almost deliberate. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. After all, I was the only one in the office now. But then, the noise came again, louder this time, followed by a sudden shift in the air conditioning that made the room feel colder. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up from my desk, moving cautiously toward the hallway. The overhead lights flickered once before going dim. The hallway stretched out in front of me, empty, as it always was at this hour. My footsteps were the only sound that echoed in the silence. The tapping continued, this time coming from the janitor's closet. The door was slightly ajar. It had been locked earlier in the day, I knew that for sure. But now, it was open, just a crack, as though someone had deliberately left it that way. I hesitated. The rational part of me told me it was probably just the janitor finishing up his duties. But then, why wasn't the closet fully closed? Why wasn't there anyone else around? I stepped closer, feeling the weight of the silence press in on me. The tapping stopped as I reached the door. I stood still for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just an old building, with pipes making noise or wind moving things around. But the door, just slightly ajar, looked inviting in the worst way. I slowly pushed it open with my hand, my heart beating faster now. Inside, the closet was empty. The broom and cleaning supplies were neatly arranged along the wall, but there was no sign of anyone or anything unusual. I exhaled, relieved. Maybe it had just been a draft or some stray noise from the old walls. But then, I noticed something strange. A piece of paper had been shoved underneath the door, crumpled and torn, as if someone had hastily pushed it out of the closet. I bent down and picked it up, my hand shaking slightly as I smoothed it out. It was a note, written in a hurried scrawl. "You shouldn't be here." I stared at the words for a long time, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Who would leave this? It didn't make sense. I looked around the empty hallway, feeling suddenly aware of the isolation around me. Was someone playing a prank? Had someone been in here, hiding? I shoved the note into my pocket, trying to shake off the feeling of dread settling over me. I needed to finish the report and go home. There was no reason to overthink it. But as I turned to head back to my desk, I froze. The sound was back. This time, it wasn't just tapping, it was a shuffling noise, slow, dragging. And it was coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was as empty as it had been when I first stepped out of my office. My pulse quickened. My feet felt heavy, as though the floor had become uncomfortably sticky, unwilling to let me move forward. I walked faster, my footsteps louder now, almost too loud for my liking. The noise, whatever it was, seemed to follow me, just out of sight. I quickened my pace again, my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline spiking. I reached my office door and pushed it open, relief flooding over me. The tapping had stopped. The hallway was silent once more. I turned to close the door behind me, but as I did, I noticed something on the floor, a shadow. It shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a shadow from the office lights. This was darker, deeper, like a shape that didn't belong. I bent down to inspect it, my breath shallow. It was faint, but it was unmistakably there. A dark shape in the exact outline of a person just beyond the door. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the empty office. I backed away, shaking now. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. I grabbed my coat, my bag, and rushed for the exit, the unease growing with each step. The front door was locked, of course, just like always. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers slick with sweat, but it wouldn't open. The keys didn't fit. The door was jammed. I turned to look around the office, the walls closing in, and that's when I saw it again. The shadow, now standing right outside my office. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The air in the room grew heavier, colder. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. The battery had died, and there was no signal. I pounded on the door, hoping someone would hear me, but the office remained silent. Then, the lights flickered one last time before completely shutting off, plunging me into complete darkness. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, just the cold, empty silence surrounding me. The unseen passenger. It was just after 7 in the evening when I left the office. I had stayed later than usual to finish up a presentation for an important meeting the following day. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in a soft glow of streetlights flickering as I made my way to the subway station. I'd taken this route hundreds of times before, but tonight, something felt off. The air felt thicker than usual, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The subway platform was mostly empty, save for a few commuters staring absent-mindedly at their phones. The usual hum of the overhead lights and the distant rumble of the tracks filled the air. I stood by the edge of the platform, checking my watch. The train was a few minutes late, but that wasn't unusual. As the minutes passed, I began to notice a man standing at the opposite end of the platform. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and had his hands shoved deep into his pockets. There was something about the way he stood, facing the tracks, not moving, not even glancing around, that struck me as odd. But, I thought, maybe he was just waiting for his train, too. I shifted my attention back to the approaching train. The screech of the brakes as it neared was deafening, and the sound seemed to echo off the walls of the underground station. I took a step back from the edge, just as I always did, watching the doors of the train open. People filed in, and I followed suit, stepping into the car. The train car was mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers. I found a seat by the window, where I could watch the city rush by as we made our way toward my stop. The doors closed with a thud, and the train jerked into motion. A few minutes passed in silence. I glanced around at the other passengers. Most of them had their heads down, lost in their phones or staring vacantly out the windows. It was easy to forget how alone you could feel in a crowded place like this. Then, I felt it. A strange, almost imperceptible sensation, like someone was watching me. I turned my head toward the opposite side of the car, and there, standing at the far end, was the man from the platform. He was facing the window, his back to the rest of the car. He hadn't boarded at the same stop I did, and I certainly hadn't seen him enter. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't looking at anyone, not even the other passengers, just staring blankly out the window as the train rattled along. His presence seemed to fill the space in a way that was unsettling, like he didn't quite belong, like he was a part of the scenery but also completely disconnected from it. The train lurched, and I glanced away, trying to focus on something else. But my eyes kept drifting back to him, as though my mind was unwilling to let go of the nagging sensation. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my skin prickling. There was a strange stillness about him, a kind of calm that felt too deliberate. When the train stopped at the next station, the man turned his head, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes were hollow, dark, unblinking, almost vacant. The kind of eyes you don't forget once you've seen them. Before I could look away, he stepped forward, his footsteps soft against the warm floor of the train car. But instead of getting off, he moved down the aisle toward me, slow and deliberate. The train doors closed, and I felt a rising sense of panic. My throat went dry, and my palms began to sweat. What was he doing? Why was he coming toward me? I gripped the edge of my seat, unsure of what to do. The car had grown eerily quiet, the noise of the train and the city outside fading into a distant hum. I looked around. No one else seemed to notice him or the strange tension in the air. They were all too absorbed in their own worlds. The man stopped directly in front of me. He didn't say a word, just stood there, looking at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. My heart pounded in my chest. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath cold against my cheek. I could smell something faint, like old wood and dust. His presence felt oppressive, as if the air around us had thickened, pressing down on me. I tried to shift away, but my body felt rooted to the seat. Then, without warning, he stepped back and turned toward the door. The same eerie calmness in his movements. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined the whole thing. I looked around again, still no one seemed to notice the man or the strange encounter. The train slowed, approaching the next station. The man was already at the door, ready to exit. He looked back one last time before the doors opened, his eyes locking onto mine with a look that sent a chill down my spine. The doors slid open, and he stepped out of the train without a sound. As the train pulled away, I looked out the window, but there was no sign of him on the platform. I felt a sense of relief, though the unsettling feeling lingered. I turned my attention back to the window, watching the lights of the city blur as we moved further underground. A minute passed before I realized something. I hadn't seen him get off at any other stop. In fact, the man was nowhere to be found. And as the train made its way toward my stop, I couldn't help but wonder, was he ever really there? The distant echo. The evening was cool and crisp, the kind of late autumn night where the air carries the scent of wet leaves and distant rain. I was walking home after a long day at the office, the streets relatively quiet. I lived on the outskirts of town, so there wasn't much traffic after dark. My shoes clicked against the pavement as I walked down the sidewalk, the faint hum of the streetlights punctuating the silence. I liked the solitude. There was something calming about being alone, especially at night. As I neared the corner, I noticed something unusual. Across the street, at the old diner that had been closed for years, the lights were on. It was odd because the place had been empty for as long as I could remember. The dusty windows and weathered sign had always made it look abandoned, but tonight, The fluorescent glow from inside was unmistakable. I paused for a moment, unsure of what to think. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking my thoughts. It was a message from my friend Carla, asking how my day went. I quickly typed a reply, then shoved my phone back into my jacket. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to cross the street and take a closer look. As I stepped onto the sidewalk in front of the diner, the door creaked open. I froze. No one had been inside the diner for years. I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from inside, soft and slow, as though someone was walking around in the dark. "Hello?" I called, my voice feeling louder than I intended. No response. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. The faint glow from inside flickered, like someone was playing with the light switch. I could feel a sense of unease crawling up my spine, but I had to know what was going on. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The diner was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the chilly night air outside. The space was covered in dust, the tables and booths left untouched as though frozen in time. But what struck me most was the smell, the stale air mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place. I looked around, the glow of the fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the floor. Then, I saw him. Sitting in the farthest booth, a man was hunched over, staring down at a cup of coffee. His coat was dark, his face obscured by the angle at which he sat. He didn't look up when I entered. I stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. The diner was supposed to be empty. I had never seen anyone inside, and I knew for a fact it had been closed for years. Still, something about this man seemed wrong. His presence felt too quiet, too still. The kind of stillness that made the air heavy. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder would somehow break the silence. He didn't answer. His hands remained clasped around the coffee cup, unmoving. I took a few steps forward, closer to the booth, but something made me hesitate. A sudden feeling of dread washed over me, like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. I turned around, planning to leave, but that's when I heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper, almost drowned out by the hum of the lights. "Stay." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was barely audible, but it came from the man in the booth. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The urge to leave was overpowering, but my feet felt heavy, like they were stuck to the floor. I took a step back, my hand brushing the edge of a table as I did, and that's when I saw it, the reflection in the window. I don't know how to explain it, but the reflection was wrong. The man in the booth wasn't alone. There was something else with him, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a vague shape, a shadow almost, moving in tandem with him, its form stretching unnaturally along the walls. My breath caught in my throat. I turned, fully now, to face the man. His head was tilted slightly, and his eyes, dark, hollow, finally met mine. They were empty, devoid of emotion or recognition, just deep, endless black. And then, without a word, he stood up. I don't remember exactly how I got out of there, but somehow, my legs carried me back to the door, and I found myself standing in the cold night air again, gasping for breath. I turned around, expecting to see the diner behind me, but it was gone. There was nothing but a brick wall, empty space where the diner had stood just moments before. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? The diner, the man, the strange shadow? My pulse was racing, and I could feel the cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I glanced at the street sign across the road. The name of the street was the same, but the area, it didn't look right. The buildings I had passed earlier were no longer there. Instead, I was standing in front of a vacant lot, the land barren and overgrown. I stumbled back, my mind spinning, not sure if I had crossed some kind of threshold into another world or if I was simply losing my grip on reality. The night was silent again, the only sound my own breathing as I hurried home, too scared to look back. I never saw that diner or that man again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that whisper, soft and insistent. Stay. The last call. It was the kind of evening where everything seemed to blur together, the sky a dull gray, the city noise muffled by the rain that had been falling for hours. I was just finishing up my shift at the bar, wiping down the counters and making sure everything was in order. It had been a slow night, the kind of night where time seems to stretch longer than usual and the hours drag on. The only company was the occasional clink of glass and the low hum of the fridge. I was about to lock the door when I heard the familiar jingle of the bell above it. Someone had entered. I looked up, a little surprised. It was nearly 2 in the morning, the usual closing time for the bar, and most people had already filtered out. The man who stepped inside was tall, dressed in a dark overcoat, the collar turned up to shield against the rain. He didn't speak, just walked in and took a seat at the far end of the bar, facing the wall. His posture was rigid, like he was trying to make himself as small as possible, but there was something unnerving about the way he seemed to blend into the shadows. I approached him cautiously. "What can I get you?" I asked, trying to sound as polite as I could. He didn't look up immediately. Instead, he placed an envelope on the bar in front of him, then slowly slid it toward me. His hand was pale, almost sickly looking, but his fingers were long and delicate. I raised an eyebrow, but before I could ask any questions, he spoke. "I'll have a whiskey," he said, his voice low, almost muffled by the rain outside. It was the kind of voice that made you feel like you weren't supposed to hear it. I poured the drink, setting it down in front of him, but he still didn't look at me. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the envelope. The silence between us felt heavy, as though the air had thickened in the room. Something about the man unsettled me, his stillness, the way he seemed to occupy the space without ever really being present. I tried to push the feeling aside. It wasn't the first time someone had come in late, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was something in his demeanor, something in his quiet that felt off, like he was waiting for something that wasn't yet here. I reached for the envelope, glancing at it cautiously. The paper was worn, yellowed with age, and the corners were folded in a way that seemed too deliberate. I touched it lightly, and the coldness of it sent a shiver down my spine. "Who's it for?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. He didn't answer immediately, but when he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through me. "Just deliver it," he said, his tone unwavering, as though he had said it 1,000 times before. My hand hovered over the envelope for a moment, unsure of what to do. I'd never seen this man before, and the request seemed too strange to ignore. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Something about the envelope felt like it was asking to be opened, like it carried some weight I couldn't ignore. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled out a single sheet of paper. There was nothing written on it at first, just a blank, empty space. Then, as if the ink had been waiting for the right moment to appear, a message slowly started to form, scrawled in dark, messy handwriting. "Don't forget me. I froze, the words sinking into my chest like a lead weight. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. There was no signature, no other words, just that chilling line. I looked up at the man, my throat dry. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. But he was gone. I didn't hear him leave. 1 second, he was sitting there, and the next, the bar was silent again, empty except for the stillness in the air. I glanced around, my stomach twisting. The door was still closed, and I rushed over to check, but it was locked. There was no way he could have left without me noticing. My mind raced. I stood there, feeling the coldness of the room creep into my bones, and I had the strangest feeling, one I couldn't shake, that I had just missed something. Or someone. The envelope, still in my hand, felt heavier than before. I looked at it again, but there was nothing more, just the message, as though it had been waiting for me to read it. I glanced at the clock. It was almost closing time, but I couldn't bring myself to lock up just yet. I had to know. I had to find out what had just happened. I walked to the back of the bar, to the small office where I kept the register, and paused by the window. The rain had stopped. That's when I noticed the shadow, standing just outside the glass. The same figure, tall and still, staring back at me from the street. He wasn't moving, just watching, his face hidden in the dark. And then, just like before, he was gone. I turned around, my heart racing, and there, on the bar counter, was a single glass, empty, except for a small ring of condensation. I could feel the coldness in the air settle deeper into my bones. I didn't stay much longer that night. I locked up and left the bar, my steps quick and uneven as I walked into the rain-soaked streets. I tried to shake the image of the man from my mind, but the feeling lingered, the sensation that I had been marked, that the encounter had somehow changed everything. And the envelope? It was gone by morning, along with the memory of the man. But I never forgot the words he left behind. "Don't forget me." The silent passenger. It was nearly midnight when I boarded the last train back home. The station was empty, the platform lit only by the cold glow of the overhead lamps. I had missed the earlier trains, and now I found myself alone, waiting for the final one of the night. The rhythmic click of my boots on the concrete echoed in the silence, and the faint hum of distant machinery was the only other sound. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the chill of the autumn air sinking into my bones. The station was old, an aging relic of the past, and it always felt deserted, even in the middle of the day. But at night, it was even worse. The silence pressed in on me, making every footstep feel like it was heard by 1,000 invisible ears. The train arrived, its headlights cutting through the dark as it rolled into the station. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and I stepped inside, relieved to finally be heading home. The inside of the train was empty, save for one passenger. He was sitting at the far end of the car, his back to me. I chose a seat a few rows ahead of him, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that gnawed at the back of my mind. The train started moving, and the rhythmic sway of the car was comforting in its monotony. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through social media, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence felt too thick, too suffocating. After a few stops, the train was still nearly empty. It was just the two of us now, but the man hadn't moved. His back was still to me, his head slightly tilted forward, as though he were deep in thought, or perhaps asleep. He hadn't made a sound, not since I first boarded. I stared at the man, wondering why he seemed so familiar. There was something about the way he sat, so still and unmoving, that struck me as odd. His clothes were simple, dark jeans, a worn-out jacket, but there was a certain sharpness to him, an intensity that I couldn't quite place. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I was just tired, overthinking things as usual. But even as I tried to look away, my eyes kept drifting back to him. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he sat there, frozen, motionless, like a statue. The train passed through a dark tunnel, and when the lights flickered back on, I noticed something strange. The man had turned around. Slowly. So slowly that I wondered if I had imagined it. But now, his eyes were fixed on me. His gaze was intense, almost unnerving, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me. His face was expressionless, but there was something in the way he looked at me, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. I tried to focus on the window, watching the city pass by in blurred lights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still staring at me. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer, I couldn't tell. The air in the car felt heavier now, suffocating, as though it were pressing down on me. I glanced over at him again, but he was still sitting there, unmoving, staring directly at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I turned back to the window, clutching my seat. Something in my gut told me that I needed to get off the train. But the next stop wasn't for another 10 minutes, and the station was deserted at this hour. It was late, too late to be getting off alone in the middle of nowhere. I shifted in my seat, trying to distract myself, but the unease in my chest grew with each passing second. And then the train slowed, its wheels grinding against the tracks. We were nearing the next stop. The man stood up. I hadn't seen him move, hadn't heard a sound, but suddenly he was standing in front of me, blocking my view of the door. I froze. He was taller than I had initially thought, his figure casting a long shadow in the dim light. I wanted to ask him to move, but my throat felt tight, and no words came. He leaned down, his face now inches from mine. His breath was cold, and I could smell something strange, like metal and earth. "Get off with me," he whispered. His voice was low, almost a hiss, but it carried an unmistakable weight, like a command. I swallowed, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to tell him to leave me alone, to back off, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself nodding, as if some invisible force was making the decision for me. The train reached the stop, and the doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. Without thinking, I stood up, my legs shaky, and followed him off the train. I don't know why I didn't resist. It didn't make sense, but something in me, something primal, urged me to follow. The platform was eerily quiet, the lights dim, casting long shadows across the concrete. There were no other passengers, no sign of anyone else. I glanced around, feeling a surge of panic rising in my chest. Where had the man gone? I didn't see him at first, but then, from the corner of my eye, I spotted him standing at the far end of the platform, his back turned to me. I hesitated, taking a few steps forward, and then, without warning, he turned. His face was still expressionless, but his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, were now wide open, fixed directly on me. He didn't move. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that strange, silent standoff, but in that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. There was no train anymore. The station, the platform, everything was still. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. I turned and ran. The echoing silence. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when I decided to take the long way home from work. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, so my schedule was usually all over the place. But today had been particularly draining, constant revisions, too many emails, and a tight deadline looming over me. My head was aching, and I needed to clear my mind. I walked through the empty streets of the neighborhood, avoiding the main roads. The smell of wet pavement and the faint sound of distant traffic filled the air. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast, giving everything an ashen, muted tone. There was something oddly peaceful about the quiet. As I approached the small park near my apartment, I saw that the benches were wet and the trees still dripped with water. I usually walked through here on my way home, but something felt different tonight. The park felt emptier than usual, almost as though the world itself had taken a step back. I figured it was the rain, the lateness of the hour, or maybe just my tired mind playing tricks. I passed by the fountain in the center of the park, which had been broken for months. The water no longer flowed, and the stones were covered in layers of grime. I had grown used to its silence, but tonight it seemed louder, somehow. It wasn't the usual quiet. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like someone was watching, the kind that pulled at the edges of your mind. I kept walking, but then I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, but they echoed in the emptiness of the park. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone walking behind me, maybe a late-night jogger or someone else out for a walk. But the path was empty. No one in sight. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. There was no one there, just the echoes of my own thoughts. I resumed walking, but the feeling didn't leave. The sound of footsteps came again, only this time they were closer. I stopped in my tracks, a cold rush of fear hitting my chest. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. The park seemed even darker now, the shadows deeper. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting brief, distorted shadows across the grass. The footsteps were unmistakable. Someone, or something, was behind me. I turned around again, and this time, I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the park, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. He was tall, wearing a dark, withered jacket and a hat that shaded his face. His stance was strange, stiff, as if he was waiting for something. But there was no one else around, just him, standing there, perfectly still. I couldn't explain why, but my body tensed. A knot formed in my stomach, and I instinctively took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something about him, something unsettling. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without a sound, he started walking toward me. His steps were slow and deliberate, but there was something almost unnatural about them, like he was gliding just above the ground. His movements were too smooth, too calculated, and it made every step he took feel like a threat. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I felt paralyzed, trapped in that moment of pure fear. I had no idea why, but I knew I had to get away. As he got closer, I finally found my voice. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer immediately. He just kept walking toward me, his face still hidden by the shadow of his hat. The silence between us was suffocating, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, as if he had been waiting for me to speak, he stopped. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, still as stone, his head slightly tilted to the side. I took a hesitant step backward, my breath shallow. I could feel the sweat on my palms, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I demanded, though the words felt weak, desperate. The man didn't respond. His posture remained unnervingly still. I turned and ran. My footsteps were heavy against the wet pavement as I sprinted down the path toward the exit of the park. I didn't dare look back, afraid that if I did, I'd see him standing right behind me. I reached the gate and pushed through, my chest burning as I ran faster. I could still hear the echo of his footsteps behind me, although when I dared glance over my shoulder, there was no sign of him. Just the empty streets, the quiet darkness. By the time I reached my apartment, I was out of breath, my heart still racing. I locked the door behind me, but the feeling of unease didn't leave. The silence in my apartment was deafening, and it felt too quiet, too still. I sat down on the couch, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the longer I thought about it, the less I could explain. I had seen him. I had heard his footsteps. But there was no one following me when I turned around. There was no sign of anyone at all. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever, and I realized something chilling. The man had never said a word to me. He hadn't done anything, but his presence had been enough. Enough to make me feel like I wasn't alone, like I was being watched even now. I didn't sleep much that night. And when I left for work the next morning, the park was empty again, just like it always had been. But the memory of his stillness, his silence, stayed with me, echoing through the quiet of my mind. I haven't been back to that park since. The wrong floor. It was late, later than I expected. My office building, a nondescript concrete tower in the heart of the city, was nearly empty, as it usually was on nights like this. I was finishing up a report for a client meeting tomorrow, my mind still swirling with numbers and deadlines when I realized that I'd missed the last train home. I wasn't in the mood to wait for the next one, so I decided to take the elevator down and grab a taxi instead. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator was quiet, the kind of silence that felt thick, almost suffocating. It was a normal evening, except for the fact that the building had been completely deserted. The only other person I'd seen was the janitor, who had long since left for the night. As the doors slid closed, I absent-mindedly checked my phone, scrolling through messages, barely paying attention to the soft hum of the elevator as it started its descent. But something felt off the moment it passed the second floor. I'm not sure why, but it was the sound that got me, like the elevator's motor had begun to grow louder, almost as if it was struggling. I frowned and glanced at the control panel. The numbers above the door showed it was passing through the 5th floor. That didn't make sense. I had pressed the button for the ground floor. I looked around, hoping to spot a sign or something that could explain it, but the walls of the elevator were featureless, the metal doors reflecting only my weary face. The elevator moved slowly, its descent unnervingly sluggish. I thought maybe the system was malfunctioning, but I had been in this building hundreds of times, and this had never happened before. The hum became a low, grinding sound, and then nothing. The elevator stopped. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, but nothing happened. I waited for a few seconds, tapping my foot impatiently. No response. That's when I noticed the display above the door. It now read floor 7. I cursed under my breath. I hadn't pressed the 7th floor. I could have sworn I hadn't. I felt a wave of unease settle on my stomach. I pressed the button for the door to open, hoping that I had somehow accidentally pushed the wrong one, but nothing happened. I pressed it again, harder this time, my finger trembling with frustration. Still, no response. My heart rate quickened. There were no more buttons to press, only that strange floor 7 label staring back at me. I felt a chill as I realized the elevator wasn't moving anymore. It was completely still. I glanced at the emergency button, but then a sudden thought struck me. What if I wasn't alone? A muffled sound came from behind me, like the scrape of something heavy against the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I twisted around quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The elevator was still empty. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I turned back toward the control panel, something caught my eye. A shadow, a figure, was standing at the far end of the elevator, just out of direct view. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. I couldn't make out any details, but there was something about the shape of it that didn't belong. It was too tall, too still. The shadow didn't move with the kind of rhythm I expected. It just hung there, suspended, like it was waiting. My hands were clammy, my mind racing. I pressed the button for the door again, but nothing happened. The figure didn't seem to notice me, or maybe it did, and it was just waiting for the right moment to make its move. Suddenly, the elevator jolted forward with a sharp jerk, snapping me back to reality. The control panel now read floor 8, but I didn't feel the usual slow glide of the descent. It was as if the elevator was being pulled by something else, something I couldn't see. The shadow began to shift, its shape becoming clearer, as if it were growing. My breath caught in my throat as it moved closer. The lights flickered, and for a split second, everything went dark. A scream stuck in my throat, but before I could make a sound, the lights came back on. The shadow was gone. My chest tightened with fear, and I quickly pressed the button for the ground floor again. The elevator shuddered violently as it began to move, but this time it was much faster. Too fast. The numbers on the panel blurred as they sped past 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, until finally the doors slid open at the ground floor. I didn't stop to look back. I ran out of the elevator, out of the building, into the cold night air, not caring who saw me, not caring about anything but the sudden, overwhelming urge to get as far away as possible. I never took that elevator again. And every time I pass that building, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. The silent call. It was a calm evening, just after dusk, when I left my friend's apartment. The kind of night when everything feels a little slower, a little quieter. I had stayed longer than I meant to, catching up on life and work over a few too many drinks, but it wasn't a problem. The bus stop was only a block away, and the night air felt fresh. I was looking forward to getting home, to a warm shower and a quiet evening. I didn't think twice about the route I usually took. It was a straight path down the street, past a small convenience store, a couple of side streets, and the bus stop at the corner. It was familiar, nothing out of the ordinary. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps was the only thing that filled the air. The street was relatively empty, just a few cars passing here and there, a distant hum of voices in the wind. The city seemed quiet for once, almost peaceful. But then, as I passed a side street, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a phone ringing. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. At first, I figured it was just some random person's phone, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't coming from any direction around me. It seemed to be coming from behind a narrow, dark alleyway on the corner. I wasn't sure why, but something about it didn't sit right with me. There was no one around, and I couldn't remember hearing anyone walk down the alley. My curiosity piqued. I took a few cautious steps towards the alley. The ringing continued, faint but constant. I stood at the entrance for a moment, debating whether I should investigate. The alley was narrow and lined with overgrown bushes, barely enough light from the street lamps to see where it led. It felt wrong, too quiet, too empty, but the ringing, it was persistent, like it was waiting for someone to pick up. I glanced at my phone, no calls. It wasn't mine. Just go to the bus stop, I told myself. It's not worth it. But there was something that pulled me in. Maybe it was the eeriness of the sound, or the odd feeling that I should be the one to answer it. I stepped into the alley. The phone rang louder now, but it still sounded distant, like it was buried deep within the shadows. My heart rate quickened, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I was about to turn back when I saw it, a faint glow coming from further down the alley, reflecting off a worn-out metal mailbox. The phone had stopped ringing. I froze, listening carefully, but all I could hear was my own breathing. The phone had gone quiet. But then, just as I was about to leave, it rang again, a single, sharp ring that echoed in the still air. The sound felt oddly personal, like it was calling out to me. I glanced down the alley once more. The glow was still there. But now, there was something else. A shadow. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the streetlight, still as stone. I squinted. It looked like a person, but they weren't moving. It wasn't normal, not the stillness, not the silence. I stepped back instinctively, my pulse racing. The figure didn't respond, didn't acknowledge me. It was as if they hadn't even noticed I was there. The ringing started again, this time more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to reach me. The phone, it was right there. I could almost hear it clearly now, though I couldn't see where it was coming from. I started walking backward, toward the main street, my breath shallow, my skin prickling with unease. The shadow remained. I reached the edge of the alley and glanced back one more time, almost expecting it to be gone, but the figure was still standing there, unmoving, locked in place. I didn't wait another second. I turned and rushed back to the street, my feet pounding against the pavement, the ringing still echoing in my mind. By the time I reached the bus stop, I was gasping for air. I checked my phone again, nothing. No missed calls. No messages. No sign of anything that could explain the sound. The bus arrived a few minutes later. I got on, took a seat near the back, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I wasn't sure what had happened. I wasn't sure what that figure in the alley had been. But as the bus pulled away and I glanced back toward the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure stood at the entrance of the alley, just watching, unmoving. I didn't know how long it had been there, or how it had followed me without making a sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it hadn't been there to simply watch. I haven't walked down that street again. I can't shake the thought of that phone ringing, the eerie stillness of the alley, and the figure that had waited for me. The truth is, I don't think I ever want to know who, or what, was trying to reach me that night. The empty bench. It had been a long day at work, and the air outside felt heavy, humid, as if the city was holding its breath before a storm. I was walking home, taking the usual route through the park. I needed the calm, the quiet after the noise of the office. The park was a small, overlooked place, but it was just close enough to my apartment that I didn't mind walking through it, even if the sun had already dipped below the horizon. I noticed the bench right away. I didn't usually sit on it, but there was something about it tonight. It wasn't particularly special, just a weathered wooden bench under a large oak tree, but it looked inviting. The kind of place that called out to you after a stressful day, a simple refuge in the middle of the park. I walked over to it, my footsteps muffled by the soft earth, and sat down. The night was quiet. The distant sounds of traffic mixed with the rustling of the leaves, a soft breeze moving through the branches overhead. I leaned back, letting out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to release. But then, I noticed something strange. The bench wasn't completely empty. A small, faded bag sat next to me on the bench. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen it there when I first sat down. It wasn't out of place in terms of its appearance, a simple black canvas bag, worn from use, but it felt wrong. There was something about it that made me uneasy. It wasn't just the fact that it had appeared out of nowhere, it was the way it was placed. Neatly positioned, as if someone had set it down deliberately, waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't sure what to do. The park was practically deserted, and it was late. I thought about leaving it alone, maybe even standing up and walking away, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. What if someone had lost it? What if it was important? I carefully reached for it, my fingers brushing against the warm fabric. The bag felt oddly warm, as if it had been sitting there for hours, absorbing the heat from the sun that had long since disappeared. I opened it slowly, trying not to let my mind wander to the worst-case scenario. Inside was a small notebook, a few crumpled papers, and a weathered photograph. I pulled the photograph out first. It was old, the edges yellowed with time. It was a picture of a man standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. He looked ordinary, nothing remarkable about his expression or appearance. Just a man in a photo, smiling at the camera, his eyes looking past it, almost as if he was unaware of being photographed. But something about the photo sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't explain why. I turned it over, hoping for a clue, a name, something. But there was nothing. The back of the photo was blank. I stared at it for a moment longer, trying to make sense of the unease building in my chest. I was about to put it back in the bag when I heard it. A soft rustling sound, almost imperceptible, coming from behind me. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. I glanced over my shoulder, but the park was still empty. The rustling had stopped, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, just as I was about to look back down at the photo, I heard it again. The faintest sound of footsteps, quick, light, but deliberate, moving toward me. My heart began to race, and I felt the air around me grow colder, heavier. I stood up, quickly, clutching the bag in my hand, but before I could turn around to leave, I heard a voice. It was quiet at first, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "You found it." I spun around, my pulse racing, my breath catching in my throat. The park was still empty. There was no one behind me, no one even close. I scanned the darkness around me, but there was nothing. The voice had come from nowhere, but it was as clear as day. I looked down at the bag again, my hands trembling. I needed to get out of there. I felt the weight of the photograph in my hand, a strange compulsion pulling me back to it. As I stared at it again, the man in the photo seemed to shift, his eyes suddenly focused on me, no longer past the camera, but looking directly into my own. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to look anymore, didn't want to be there, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then, the voice came again, closer this time, as if someone were standing right behind me. You shouldn't have looked. I dropped the bag, my heart pounding in my chest. Without thinking, I turned and ran, not daring to look back. I could still hear the whispering voice, faint at first, then growing louder, echoing in my mind as I fled the park. When I finally reached the street, out of breath and trembling, I turned around. The park behind me was silent once again, empty, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew I wouldn't forget. Not the voice. Not the man in the photograph. And not the feeling that something had been waiting for me. The forgotten locker. It was the last day of the semester, and the campus was quieter than usual. Most of the students had already left for their break, but I still had a few things to finish. I had just finished an exam and was walking to the student union building to grab my things. I was tired, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones, and the only thing on my mind was getting back to my apartment to relax for the evening. As I walked through the hallway, my steps echoed off the walls, the silence around me almost oppressive. I turned a corner, and the sight of the old row of lockers caught my attention. The hallway leading to them was dimly lit, and the lockers themselves were worn, some of the paint peeling away. This part of the building was rarely used anymore, and I always found it oddly comforting, like stepping into a forgotten part of the campus. Most students used the newer lockers by the main entrance, but for some reason, I had always liked this secluded section. I stopped in front of my own locker, which was the first one in the row. It was just a simple locker, nothing special, but there was something oddly familiar about it. Maybe it was the way the door never closed properly or the way the lock rattled if you turned it the wrong way. I'd always been careful to remember the combination, but for some reason, today I couldn't stop thinking about the locker next to mine. Locker number 14. I had never used it. It was always just there, empty, with a thin layer of dust collecting on the top. The numbers were faded, barely legible, but I could still make them out. The locker had been there for as long as I could remember, standing unused and forgotten in the shadows of the hallway. Curiosity gnawed at me as I stared at it. I couldn't remember ever seeing anyone use that locker. I never saw anyone nearby, no students passing by to claim it, no janitor to clean it, just an empty space with a forgotten number. I didn't even know why it was still there. Maybe it was for storage, some leftover space nobody had thought to take down. On impulse, I reached for the combination lock. It felt heavy in my hand, the cool metal smooth against my fingers. There was something strange in the air, a pressure, as if the hallway was waiting for something. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to open it. The lock clicked open after a few turns. I hesitated for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. There was something about it, something wrong, something that didn't make sense. I pulled open the door slowly, half expecting to find nothing but a pile of forgotten junk or paperwork. But what I saw inside made my stomach churn. There was a small, rusted box at the back, tucked away in the far corner of the locker. I had no idea what it was, but the way it was positioned, almost as if it had been placed carefully, made me uneasy. I reached in, the metal cold under my fingertips. The box was surprisingly heavy. It didn't make sense. This was a student locker, not a storage chest. I had never seen it before, but I felt this strange compulsion to open it. Inside the box, there was a stack of photographs. They were old, yellowed with age, the edges curling slightly. I pulled one out, feeling an odd tightness in my chest. The photo was of a small group of people, all standing together on the steps of what looked like an old school building. The picture itself wasn't unusual, just a bunch of smiling faces, nothing that stood out. But as I studied it more closely, something shifted in the background. There, in the corner, barely visible but clear enough if you looked hard enough, was the figure of a man standing just outside the group. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was rigid, as if he was standing there intentionally, watching. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I reached for another photo, my hands shaking. This one was different. The group of people was the same, but the setting had changed. They were now standing in front of the same school, but the building looked older, decayed, as though it had been abandoned for years. The sky was overcast, heavy clouds pressing down on the scene. And once again, the man was there, only this time he was much closer, standing directly behind the group, his face now partially visible. My heart raced. The man's eyes were locked onto the camera, but they weren't looking at the camera. They were looking directly at me. Suddenly, the door of the locker slammed shut. I jumped back, dropping the photo in the process. My heart was hammering in my chest. I had no idea what had just happened, but the air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating. I felt as if something had shifted, as if the building itself had noticed what I had done. I hurriedly grabbed my things from my locker, my hands trembling. I was shaking all over now, the strange feeling of being watched never leaving my side. I wanted to get out of that hallway, out of the building, but as I passed by locker 14, I couldn't help but glance at it again. It was shut now, and as I stared at the number 14, I noticed something new. There were fresh fingerprints on the glass. And they were too small, too delicate, to belong to anyone else. I had no idea who had been in that locker before me, but I knew one thing: I would never, ever go near that locker again. The calling. I'd always thought of myself as someone who didn't believe in anything beyond the everyday. Life was simple. Work, meals, sleep, repeat. Nothing extraordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. But that changed one Thursday evening. It was just after 6 when I left the office, the kind of quiet evening that signaled the end of the workday, with the city streets still buzzing but slowly calming down as people headed home. I had the usual evening routine ahead of me: grocery shopping, dinner, maybe some TV. The same as any other week. But as I walked to my car, I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but the voice, low, distant, seemed to call my name. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. It was clear. Rachel. I glanced around, but the street was empty. Just a few parked cars and the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The voice had been close, but there was no one in sight. My pulse quickened. Maybe I was just hearing things. It had been a long day, after all. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination running wild, but the moment I started walking again, I heard it again. Rachel. This time, I froze, my hand gripping the car keys tighter. The voice was more distinct now, almost urgent. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, down the narrow alley that ran between 2 old brick buildings. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to move toward it. I couldn't explain why, but my body seemed to act on its own. I walked toward the alley, my steps hesitant at first, the sound of my shoes echoing off the walls. The alley was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long and thick between the buildings. The air felt colder here, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't stop. The voice, it was calling me. Rachel. It was closer now. I was almost at the end of the alley when I saw it. A small door, hidden in the shadows between the buildings. I had never seen it before. It wasn't there this morning or any other day I had walked this route. But now, it stood in front of me, dark and old, its wood chipped and weathered, as if it had been waiting. I felt an overwhelming sense of curiosity mixed with fear, my heart racing in my chest. There was no reason for me to open that door, to step inside. But something inside me urged me forward, a force I couldn't resist. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound unnerving in the silence of the alley. Inside was a small room, its walls lined with shelves full of dusty books and strange objects. The air smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten things. And there, in the center of the room, was a chair. Simple, wooden, but oddly out of place in the middle of the cluttered room. On the seat, a thin, yellowed piece of paper was folded neatly. I felt a cold rush of air sweep through the room as I approached it, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I picked up the paper. There was no name, no greeting, just a single line of writing, written in careful, precise script. You were expected. A shiver ran down my spine. Expected? By whom? And why me? The air seemed to press in on me, the walls feeling closer with every passing second. I didn't want to stay. I had to leave. But the door, the only exit, was now gone. The alley behind me had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of darkness. Panic began to rise in my chest, and I felt trapped. I turned around, my eyes desperately searching for another way out, when I saw him. A man. Standing in the corner, his face obscured by the shadows, watching me. I couldn't make out his features, but I knew he was there. I could feel his presence, like something ancient and cold. The voice came again, this time louder, more distinct. You should have never come. I backed away, stumbling over the clutter in the room. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could focus on was the man in the corner, his eyes, now glowing faintly, never leaving mine. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to run, but the walls were closing in, the room shrinking with every step. I ran in a blind panic, not knowing where to go, not knowing how to escape. The room twisted, the walls shifting, the ground beneath me warping like it was alive. The door that had once been behind me was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was still. The walls returned to their normal shape. The chair was empty. The door had reappeared. I stood there, gasping for air, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. My heart was still racing, but the room felt calm, almost welcoming again. The air wasn't cold anymore. I looked at the door, the way out, and before I could stop myself, I stepped through it. The alley was back, the streetlights still casting their soft glow on the pavement. Everything was as it had been before. But something had changed. I wasn't the same. I glanced behind me, expecting to see the old door, the room, but there was nothing. It was just a regular alley, nothing unusual about it. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been there before, that I had always been expected. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.